Sonic Frontiers is my favorite Sonic game. It made me laugh, it made me cry. Playing it was not just the happiest I've been with a Sonic game, but any game in a long time. But it's not flawless. It still needs a ton of work, but the bones and groundwork of an incredible series going forward has been laid. And that excites me. Sonic Team says they're going to be taking feedback on Sonic Frontiers seriously. So I'll be giving them some serious feedback. I'll be critiquing every aspect of the game, so this is going to be a long one. Please remember to like the video, comment down below on your thoughts, and share it around, because if this video can reach Sonic Team's notice and inspire change, it would mean the world to me. I'll be starting this video with a focus on the combat systems and mechanics, because not counting the story, that is what I was most excited about when this game was finally showed back in June of 2022. Now, let's discuss what Sonic can do, what I like about these things, how they can be improved for the sequel, and what needs to be added. I'll also be using a PlayStation controller when describing button input, since that's what I use, and it will help avoid confusion. I moved Sonic Boom and Boost to L1 and R1, and put Dodge and Quickstep on L2 and R2, since it made magnet dashing a lot easier on me. A lot of the footage in these videos will be using the Hedgehog May Cry mod by Kirby Crew 661, which I heavily recommend everyone give a try. While also not flawless, it does a ton to improve the way Sonic feels to control in both the open zone and cyberspace, while also overhauling the combat. There will be spoilers in this video, because it's insanely difficult to give an in-depth critique on the game without spoiling the game. This is your only warning. Before I start dissecting all of my issues with the combat system, I do need to stress that I did have a good time overall, and that I do think going the character action route a la Bayonetta and Devil May Cry is the right direction to go down, and that this is a leap in the right direction, not a step, a massive leap. Now let's talk about what Sonic can do right out of the gate. He can run, boost, jump, double jump, air boost, drop dash, stomp, homing attack, punch kick slide, parry, dodge, lock on, and light speed dash. In terms of movement, this is the best Sonic has ever controlled in a mainline 3D Sonic game, and if some things feel off, you have the capacity to tweak his movement and camera a bit to your liking. And this should absolutely be brought back and improved in the sequel. Accessibility options are always a good thing, and Sonic by his very nature is something that not everyone is going to jive with by default, no matter what you do. It's physically impossible to make a Sonic that everyone on the planet will like to control. It can't happen. You're going to hear me say this a lot, but Sonic losing his speed and momentum every time you jump and double jump feels terrible. And he should be able to do the same momentum jumps he can do on rails in normal play, just like in Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, Unleashed, and Generations, etc. There should have been a speed loss from jumping slider, as well as a maximum height from a jump. This is kind of what the bounce slider is supposed to do, but it's only for running off specific inclines, when it should have been for all of them, and for Sonic's slope jumps. Sonic's feet shouldn't magnetize to the ground, and he shouldn't fall like a rock at seemingly random. In fact, high speed style is what action style should have been, and high speed style should have been closer to the physics in the Hedgehog May Cry mod. I do like that jumping on enemies does still damage them, but I and many others miss getting extra bounce height from jumping on an enemy, just like in the 2D games. You can kinda do this, and cyberspace doesn't feel quite right, even with the Hedgehog May Cry mod. Removing the hitbox from the boost and making it more akin to the Lost World run button was a good call, because it forces the player to think about the enemies around them. A small part of me misses the power fantasy of running so fast enemies die on contact, but the new character action focus does still give me that sense of how powerful Sonic is without trivializing enemies and stages. I do think the running animation is too plain though. Having different running animation states is really important, and while I do love the power boost aura, the normal boost would benefit from having the Lost World figure 8 animation at higher speeds. The air boost also feels way too weak in the current version of the game, unless you're doing the homing attack air boost cancel, aka magnet dashing, but only when in cyberspace since it's not as powerful in the open zone. The Force's air boost was way too powerful for how little input from the player is required, but there definitely is a happy middle ground that can be found, and the magnet dash is that middle ground. You only get one air boost action before you touch the ground in Frontiers, which is way too limiting, and can and will lead to many frustrating deaths, especially in cyberspace. The air boost, much like jumping, should do a better job of maintaining your current speed, and you should have 2 to 3 air boost actions instead of only 1. Maybe have these extra air boost actions split into upgrades for the skill tree. There should be a HUD element that shows you how many air boosts you have left before you need to hit the ground. I do kind of like that you don't lose rings when you hit the floor, and can save yourself from taking damage with the air boost, but I think keeping the lack of invincibility frames, especially now that dodge and parry exist, and removing the Sonic getting knocked over state when he gets hit will improve the game's balance and flow quite a bit. The drop dash is here, and I like that it can be used as a combo extender and as a launcher on some enemies, but it feels really clunky. However, fixing it would be really easy. It should control and behave very similarly to the spin dash of SA1 or 2, and the Hedgehog May Cry mod, including maintaining your speed when you jump. Again, the loss of speed or momentum after a jump is just a consistent issue across the game. Make the hitbox on the drop dash a bit larger to compensate for the lack of precision and how tiny Sonic is. Add visual effects to help clue the player into how large the hitbox actually is. The drop dash requiring you jump 3 times and hold the button down until you land makes it feel terrible. It makes it not just a pain to use in combat, but also an exploration as well. All you need to do to make it way more user-friendly is let the player drop dash out of a stomp. If the player presses X after initiating a stomp, then they get the drop dash. Not only will it feel easier to do while exploring and adding to the flow of exploration, but it will make it a much better combo tool. Visually, the drop dash doesn't look great. The ball form visual is the exact same as when you are jumping. There's no squash and stretch to help emphasize the force of movement being made, and the lack of a light trail makes it significantly less visually stimulating than, say, the Sonic Heroes Rocket Excel or the spin dashes of SA1 and 2. The stomp is as awesome as it's always been, and I'm so happy it's become a mainstay since Sonic and the Secret Rings. Being able to stop my air movement at any time and come straight down, and damage enemies directly under me, is always satisfying. But there is a major issue with it that we'll come back to once we start talking about the skill tree. You can also cancel Stomp with Air Boost, and this would feel even better if you had multiple Air Boost actions like I suggested earlier. The bounce is here, but it doesn't feel as good as it did in SA2. You bounce 3 times and get a piddly little shockwave. It does insane AoE damage, but I would never say it feels particularly satisfying to do. Instead, the way it should work is that if you hold the circle button, you get the regular stomp. If you tap or mash the circle button, you get the bounce from SA2. I like a lot of what Spark 3 does. In fact, later in this video I'm going to talk about how there is a lot that can be learned from it for improving the next Sonic game by playing it, including how it handles mapping special moves to different button combinations instead of a single button. One thing about Spark 3 I don't like is that Stomp is 2 buttons instead of 1. Spark 3's control scheme really messes with my brain, especially playing it and Frontiers back to back for comparison. For instance, in Spark 3, homing attack is where Stomp would be, and Spark 3 Stomp requires 2 buttons. This has given me an epiphany. Moves that the player are going to use a lot, like the homing attack, Stomp, Parry, Air Dash, etc., should be a single button, or a single button and a direction. But more irregular moves that the player is going to use in combat or exploration, or will require more thought, should have more complex inputs like 2 buttons at the same time, a back to forward motion, a left to right motion, or something else to give the player more control and precision over their actions. The homing attack and most other attacks have a really good impact to them, I never would have thought to give the homing attack hit stop, but it was a brilliant decision to do so. It has never felt more satisfying to hit things as Sonic the Hedgehog, which was one of my major complaints about the Werehog. While the Werehog is more mechanically complex, is better animated, and technically has more that it can do, I never felt good doing any of it. The homing attack is not all positives, unfortunately. The recovery frames for the homing attack, especially in cyberspace, are way too long, and really hurt the flow of the game. Keeping their impact while allowing the player to go to their next target faster would greatly improve the game. This is another change I really appreciate in the Hedgehog May Cry mod. The homing attack also does way too much damage. The purpose of the move should be to get the player into melee range, similar to how it worked in Black Knight. It should still kill fodder platforming enemies instantly, but otherwise the damage should be on the low side in real combat scenarios. Change the homing attack input to towards the enemy on the analog stick and square at the same time, to give the player more control and precision over how Sonic fights. If Sonic successfully hits a target, be it a spring or an enemy, he should regain all of his air actions, his jump, his double jump, his air boosts. In other words, make the homing attack for Sonic his equivalent of Air Stinger for Nero or Snatch, and combine it with Enemy Step, and allow the player to cancel their various melee options with this technique. This will give the player a much greater sense of flexibility and freedom in combat. Also, while there are speed lines in Frontiers, this is still visually the least interesting homing attack in the series. The light trail that Sonic emitted in previous games needs to return for a lot of the ball form related attacks. Visual effects shouldn't always be used to compensate for a lack of good animation, but they are still important, and can hide when something isn't up to par. If it is up to par visually, visual effects make them better. The hit sparks added since the initial showcases did a lot to make Sonic's melee attacks look more interesting. In regards to the basic melee combat, things need to be changed drastically. Using a single button for combos gets really stale really fast, especially at the start of the game, where your options are so limited. Pretty much everyone agrees on this. There should be 2 or 3 attack buttons. Spectacle fighters and character action games tend to use 2 or 3, and Sonic would benefit greatly from leaning into the character action focus more heavily. Square is light attack, triangle should be medium attack, and circle should be heavy, which currently houses the slide when on the ground. My current opinion on the slide is that I wish it was either another attack button for melee combos, or a drift button. Either one would be preferable over a slide everyone is going to forget exists. Except for CyberSpace 3-5, where the drifting is so bad, it's actually smarter to just jump over the drift pads and slide around while boosting to make turning easier. Attacks involving light attack should be fast but short-ranged. Medium-related attacks are slightly slower, but attack in a wider area in front of and behind Sonic. Heavy attacks have slightly longer startup than medium attacks, but hit in even larger areas around you, and tend to have higher damage, but can't be used in the air because of the stomp. Different button chains of square, triangle, and circle should be there, and provide their own utility similar to Devil May Cry 5, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, Spark the Electric Jester, and even the Werehog, like launches, stuns, knockdown, AoE damage, damage over time, unique movement options that allow Sonic to continue doing damage while still moving around and getting out of harm's way, etc. There should be a greater distinction between what Sonic's attacks can do on the ground and in the air. I do like that almost everything can be cancelled with a dodge, parry, or a special move. That should still be there and feels good, and that kind of freedom and flexibility is mandatory for a game like this. Visually and animation-wise, one of the biggest complaints about Sonic himself in past games were that his friends were consistently more interesting than him, while he just looked really plain in comparison. And while this game does take baby steps towards making Sonic a more interesting character to play, he's still got a long way to go. In regards to what Sonic's light, medium, and heavy attacks should look like, I want more speed and wind-based moves that take advantage of the type of character he is. Please look at characters like Wamu, Swiftmaster, Chun-Li, and Sonic moves from previous games and the comics for inspiration on what other attacks and animations Sonic could have in combat. Honestly, Swiftmaster is just the blueprint for how to make fighting things as Sonic look and feel fun. You could wholesale steal a lot of what he does and give it to Sonic in the next game, and you would get zero complaints. He's the blue blur, the Knight of the Wind, the fastest thing alive, and should have moves that make me feel like I'm one with the wind. Sonic has always displayed some degree of aerokinesis, and I think playing that up from now on can only be a good thing going forward, with characters like Blaze, Silver, and Shadow existing in the series. Maybe even change his double jump to be a wind flip, and give him a slight hover to help with platforming, kind of reminiscent of Sonic and the Secret Rings instead of just the ball form jump animation again. His melee attack on square, triangle, and circle should use smear frames and wind effects, like in Sonic Battle and DNF Duel's Swift Master. Sonic characters are small and have stubby limbs, so cheating a bit and using visual effects like these to give them more reach and AoE potential like Dante or Raiden's sword swings is not only a good idea, it's a borderline necessity. Squash and stretch on its own isn't enough, and frankly looks bad when that's all you do to give Sonic more reach, especially during hit stop. Sonic should never throw single punches and kicks in a straight line. That's just dull, and doesn't really take advantage of Sonic's strength as a personality. These should be sweeping strikes, tornadoes, rapid fire punches, and kicks. Parry is badly designed, and needs to be overhauled because it breaks every single combat encounter. Here's all my issues with Parry. First, all you have to do is hold it down. There's no skill required, no timing, no resource that drains, just hold it down and win. Something that rewards the player so much shouldn't require zero execution. Second, there isn't enough of a visual indication of when I am and am not parrying. I and many others often get hit because we couldn't tell if parry was active or not, especially in the Titan battles where Sonic is so small. Third, the animation for a successful parry doesn't make any sense. No one can tell what Sonic is actually doing. I think he's slapping the attack away, but it's not conveyed in a way that makes sense to the player or others observing, and it doesn't take advantage of Sonic's personality, abilities, or aesthetic. Now, a somewhat easy blocker parry isn't a completely terrible thing. Metal Gear Rising Revengeance's parry is insanely easy to do. Hold forward and press light attack. Heck, you can even mash it, but the reward for doing that is next to nothing. But you get a decent reward for timing your parry perfectly. Royal Guard into Royal Release in Devil May Cry is a high-risk, high-reward technique that allows you to turn your defense into a massively damaging offense. I highly recommend everyone at Sonic Team play through DMC5, Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, and Spark the Electric Jester 3 for more ideas on how this mechanic and others can be improved, especially Spark 3. Director Morio Kishimoto said that DMC and Bayonetta-style combat just wasn't working for Sonic, and with all due respect, I don't believe he is correct. It's not that it wasn't working, it's that you weren't implementing it correctly. Sonic Frontiers' combat feels in a lot of ways like a DMC game that didn't have enough time to cook. The character action influence is obvious. Spark 3 shows that this kind of combat system does work for Sonic, and how you can implement it. You should be taking elements of DMC and Bayonetta, and putting your own spin on it, so it can be its own thing, which is what Spark does. Back to parry, my advice is to first change the parry animation from Sonic standing awkwardly to wind furiously blowing around him, and the movie Sonic Lightning. After a successful parry, the wind and lightning should intensify, and Sonic should do the Sonic Flare animation from Sonic Battle, damaging the enemies around him and slowing down time. While holding parry, Sonic's boost meter should rapidly drain. If Sonic's boost meter is drained completely either by boosting for too long or emptying it with parry, the rate at which the boost stamina replenishes itself should be cut in half, kind of like Negative Edge in Guilty Gear, for being too defensive or running away too much. A successful parry should regen Sonic's meter so that he can parry and boost again. The parry window should be anywhere between 40 and 80 frames before your stamina is completely drained. Enough that beginners can find it easy, but not easy enough that it's completely free. These changes would make the parry look cool for those looking for spectacle, and not bore players looking for a substantial combat system. The infinite parry likely came from it being a mandatory mechanic for beating Wyvern and the dogs, and I could very easily see those fights in particular being really frustrating with a parry window that is too short. That said, the solution should have been to give the player other ways they could attack those enemies instead of watering down the mechanics of the game. Mastery of parry in MGR and Royal Guard in DMC5 are never mandatory for beating those games. It makes those games significantly easier once you master them, but that's the point. Getting good at difficult mechanics should make the game easier, and leads to greater fulfillment on the player's end because of that difficulty in the learning process. Dodge and Quickstep feel a bit awkward currently, and despite putting in over 50 hours into the game for the sake of this video, it never felt any more natural. They would be massively improved by letting us dodge in the direction we want, by designating a single button for dodge, and letting us influence where we dodge with the analog stick, instead of us dodging in a set direction every time we press one of the two current dodge buttons. Then, relegate Quickstep to context-sensitive set pieces like Squid's back, or the iconic set pieces of Rooftop Run. The other button that used to be dodge should now be used for parry, because it actually feels really clunky and unresponsive to have to press two buttons simultaneously for a mechanic you'll need at a moment's notice. The dodging and quickstep animations also look really lame. Sonic is the fastest thing alive. He's the video game equivalent of the Flash, and his movement options should reflect that. When I quickstep, there should be smear frames like in Sonic Unleashed, and when I dodge, Sonic should phase in and out of reality for as long as he has invincibility frames. Think Slayer dashes in Guilty Gear or Air Trick in Devil May Cry. The duration of dodge slowdown on a perfect dodge should be buffed to be a bit closer to Bayonetta's Witch Time, and the duration on the slowdown for parry should be reduced dramatically, because it makes parrying future strikes borderline impossible, without relying on the nature of this game's infinite parry, which I already said is a bad mechanic. You also need to do a better job of distinguishing what attacks need to be parried, which need to be dodged, and how long the player has to do either. In MGR, attacks that need to either be dodged or run away from are designated with the color yellow because they can't be parried, while attacks that can be parried are red. In Frontiers, most attacks have the Omen sense, but not all, like Wyvern's missiles, which you need to parry, and having the Omen sense doesn't always mean the attack is parryable, like the Supreme's attacks. Now that we've talked about dodge and parry, let's take an intermission before going on with the rest of Sonic's default moveset and talk about revenge values, because they don't exist in this game outside of the Titan fights. Now, what are revenge values? This is a fairly complex topic, but I can summarize it in a digestible way fairly quickly. They are background values or variables that enables an enemy to fight back or defend themselves when they're being attacked. God of War 2, Devil May Cry, Kingdom Hearts 2, and many other games of this kind have a background variable on most enemies that forces the player to dodge, parry, or use some kind of defensive or offensive mechanic so that they can't mindlessly repeat the same actions or combos over and over again. Almost every move the player uses on an enemy raises that value, some more than others. Enemies in Frontiers and Unleashed don't have this. When people say the combat is button mashy or is shallow, they aren't articulating what they actually mean. What they actually mean is that the combat doesn't require or encourage them to think, because the enemies either can't or won't fight back. In Unleashed, with the Werehog, you can wail on non-boss enemies indefinitely, with no real fear of retaliation, and bosses and mini-bosses don't have any real stagger at all, just infinite super armor. Which means all you're going to do is use your strongest moves on them, because damage is all that matters in those instances. In Frontiers, you can juggle pretty much every enemy in the entire game, that isn't a Titan to death with no fear of consequence once you understand how the game works. Frontiers has the inverse problem of Unleashed. Your melee combos don't stagger any enemies, and your skill list moves are so ludicrously powerful and easy to chain together that enemies literally can't fight back. Now, if enemies in Frontiers had stagger on normal attacks, revenge values, and had attacks they could do in the air, they would, after a certain point, try to counterattack, which would force the player to switch up their approach, making combat more engaging. The lock-on doesn't work, and is one of my biggest issues with the game. I feel like this is all that needs to be said. I try to lock on to an enemy, and the lock-on will turn off, or switch targets at seemingly random, and after a certain point, it gets too infuriating to even bother with. When I use the right analog stick to lock on to an enemy, I expect it to stay there until I kill my target, or use the right analog stick to switch targets, not switch to another target as soon as it comes into view. I also modded in the Unleashed reticle and sound effects because the Frontiers lock-on didn't look all that visually interesting in comparison, and the lock-on sound in Frontiers actively gets on my nerves. The clicking sound was annoying when I was watching the trailers and gameplay showcases, and playing it myself, it only got more annoying as time went on. I've also seen many others also complain about this in various YouTube comments and other forums. The lock-on sound happens too often for the sound effect to be as harsh as it is in the vanilla game. The lightspeed dash in this game is actually pretty solid. It's the second best lightspeed dash in the series, behind Unleashed, which isn't a high bar, all things considered, because most lightspeed dashes in other games have a high chance of killing you, because it tends to be mapped to the same button as the bounce or roll or something else that sends you straight down. Thank God, Frontiers is finally using all the buttons on the controller unlike prior games. I like that you can pick up drop rings with it. However, like many things in this game, it needs some tweaking. First, you shouldn't completely lose your speed when the lightspeed dash ends. There's a reason a mod exists to fix this on PC already. The Beats Improved Physics mod, at the time of this recording, has a better lightspeed dash than in the Hedgehog May Cry mod. Currently in the Hedgehog May Cry mod, you go flying to your death a lot of the time. Second, while I like being able to lightspeed dash dropped rings, it is another factor in combat balance being out of whack. Whenever Sonic gets hit, his rings should scatter further and further from him like in Sonic Rush. There should be a UI element for ring scatter, which slowly drains, indicating how far rings will be scattering. Empty being normal ring scatter, full being max ring scatter. In other words, there's no way you're picking up those rings back up. Before we talk about the skill tree, let's talk about some things that need to be changed or added to the sequels. Get rid of the skill tree and just have an upgrade page, like Arkham City or Nico's van in DMC5, or even Sonic and the Secret Rings. Secret Rings' problem was not that it had an upgrade page, its problem was that your baseline default Sonic, without upgrades, was one of the worst things in the world. Let the player get almost anything at any time provided they have the skill points to buy it, and there isn't a move required to make the new one work. I should be upgrading Sonic's combat and movement options throughout the entire game. By the time I hit Chaos Island, I was basically done with the skill tree. It's also important to give Sonic a lot that he can do at the start of the adventure, because again, pressing the square button over and over again at the start of the game isn't very interesting. It's very easy to run into the default secret rings issue. Adding those medium and heavy attack buttons along with various combos for chaining them together in different combinations will do a lot to make the early game and late game less boring. The red seeds of power need to go. Defense seeds are fine, but it is impossible to balance a game's combat when you don't know how much damage a character will be doing at any given time. In other words, every strike, special move, etc. should have fixed damage, and enemies should have health with that fixed damage in mind. Combat doesn't feel satisfying when I one-shot enemies. Now, some enemies that exist purely to be platforming obstacles should be destroyed in one hit. But in the open zone, if I'm going to be fighting a group of enemies, I want to be able to style on them and be rewarded for it. especially with this game's approach to letting me run past or away from most fights. This was a brilliant design decision and makes Frontier's combat more enjoyable than the Werehog's by default, even if the Werehog is again more complex. That's not to say the combat is shallow, as some Frontier's detractors will have you believe, but it has many flaws that need to be addressed, and the level of complexity and depth a game like this should have has not yet been reached. I'm not saying that Sonic should be as complex as Dante, that's ridiculous, or have a moveset as large. Sonic's moveset should be more on par with Nero, or Spark the Electric Jester, or Raiden in terms of quantity of moves, and the depth should come from combining that more limited move pool than Dante with his unique movement that no other series can match, rather than timing inputs for Nero's Exceed mechanic or Raiden's Blade mode and his extra weapons. Sonic's equivalent to Exceed is his movement and unique momentum mechanics. Now, if we could reach the level of complexity found in Nero's gameplay or Spark 3 with Metal Gear Rising levels of spectacle here and there, the Frontier's engage at your own pace approach to combat, we could be in for one of the greatest games of all time. I can see the horizon that this franchise and Sonic team are shooting for, and that gives me hope for the future. Now let's talk about the skill tree as it is in this game. Cyloop is awesome. You're not going to hear a single person say Cyloop is lame. It is one of the coolest additions to the Sonic franchise, mechanics-wise, in a long time, and it needs to be a mainstay. Anytime you can successfully turn Sonic's movement into a form of attack is always going to be a crowd pleaser. I want to see Sonic start Cylooping things in the comics, and other media too. That's how cool it is. Great job, Sonic team. The only thing you 100% need to change is to turn Cyloop input into a 2-button hold instead of 1. Instead of holding down triangle to activate the technique, it should be holding down triangle and circle at the same time. That's literally the only thing that absolutely has to change. If you want to go the extra mile and make gaining rings from Cyloop a bit harder, you'll get no complaints from me. Maybe make the amount of rings you get based on the size of the circle and the difficulty setting. I think the Hedgehog May Cry mod goes a bit overboard in nerfing the ring generation aspect, but I do think a happy middle ground can be found for balance. Maybe change it so that you get max rings all at once from it, but only every 20 minutes or so, with a cooldown HUD element the player can keep track of. Phantom Rush needs to be tweaked a bit from a combo meter to a style meter a la Bayonetta and Devil May Cry. Incentivize me to use different attacks, combos, and special moves. I should never gain access to this state if I just mash the square button or spam Sonic Boom. It should be closer to Sin Devil Trigger and Triple S from DMC5, where it's a skill the player has to consciously activate and turn off. The higher your style, when you kill enemies, the more resources like EXP you gain. Reward the player for playing well with not just killing enemies faster and more damage, but more tangible rewards they can do something with once the battle is over. For example, in the Batman Arkham games, you get more experience points based on the number of different techniques used relative to your combo count. In the Arkham games, there is a mechanic similar to Phantom Rush called Free Flow Focus, where once a character hits a certain combo count, they enter a mode where time slows down and they speed up. They can stay in the mode for the innate buffs it provides, or they can use an enhanced version of one of their gadgets or a special move at the cost of the mode. Phantom Rush could borrow some aspects of Free Flow Focus, Sin Devil Trigger, and Triple S. Boom is really cool, and much like Cyloop, should also be a mainstay as part of Sonic's moveset throughout all media. It should be treated the same way as you would treat Dante's guns in Devil May Cry. Reduce its damage a lot, and let it be something you sprinkle in to keep your style meter up, and to get rid of certain enemy defenses like the bubble enemy on Kronos. Also, Sonic jerks back if you're close to an enemy while doing it. Don't do that. It looks and feels really unnatural and can be disorienting. Speaking of unnatural, just holding down one button to activate this move doesn't feel good, and canceling into this move from other attacks feels off, because there are moments where I'd hold the button down during a combo and nothing would happen. Change it from holding L1 to hold L1 while pressing one of the 3 attack buttons. L1 and mashing light attack gives you the sonic boom in this game as it functions in this game, but with less damage. L1 and pressing the medium attack button gives a wider range projectile that can hit multiple targets, but is slower. Holding L1 and mashing heavy has Sonic generate a tornado around himself to slow enemies down and damage them like the green gem in Sonic 06, and the player maintains the tornado by continuing to mash the heavy attack button. Wild Rush looks really cool when you can actually perform the technique. It takes pretty much every player a while to figure out how to even trigger it, because the process of doing so is so unintuitive. To perform the technique, you must press L2 or R2 and then square. This also makes the camera freak out a bunch when you do it a bunch of times, because the dodge animation and Sonic jerking back, just like I complained about with Sonic Boom. The input should be L2 and square at the same time. Instead of a pre-canned animation, let the player control where they go with the zigzag, with the control stick. The input should be L2 and square at the same time. Instead of a pre-canned animation, let the player control where they go during the zigzag with the left analog stick. Any enemies caught in the zigzag pattern should also take damage or be pushed back. An enemy that is hit with Wild Rush while guarding should have their guard broken, and have their guard disabled for a few moments. The animation length should be sped up a ton like the Hedgehog May Cry mod, and the player should still be able to dodge, boost, stomp, cancel at any time. The animation length on most of the special moves is way too long. They should never be any longer than 1.5 seconds. These camera angle shifts on a lot of them make following the action disorienting. The only one I feel is acceptable as is in this regard is Cyclone Kick. Before we start talking about the other moves of the skill tree, I need to address a problem pretty much all the moves outside of air tricks have. Whenever you perform these attacks, time stops or slows to a crawl to the point it might as well be time stop for all enemies, so there is never a reason to not just keep using a high damaging one like Stomp over and over again, because the enemies of the game literally can't react to it or stop you. Like I talked about during the revenge values and parry section of the video, there's no risk-reward or thought that needs to be put into combat once you realize this. Just combo Stomp over and over again. Another issue with the slowdown caused by these moves is that it makes timing the parry difficult, which is likely why the timing on the parry was removed in the first place, but doing so removes the depth and fun from the combat system. Remove the unlimited parry, remove the slowdown on special moves, and make the timing on the Omen danger sense more accurate to when the player will be hit. If I press parry, when the Omen appears, I expect to actually parry the attack. You'll see me fumble around with the parry on some enemies throughout this video, and it's because the Omen isn't always accurate. Master Ninja is particularly egregious in this regard because it does an attack where it clones itself and attacks you multiple times. But if you parry any of them, you get slowdown, which makes it harder to time the next parry in regards to Omen. Omen also needs to be more pronounced visually, because at times it's hard to notice it's even there, especially on Titan fights. Air tricks are neat, but it's a bit annoying that you can only get access to them when boosting off an incline without jumping, or hitting certain springs, which doesn't feel natural. Instead, air tricks should be activated by pressing down on the D-pad while Sonic is in the air, kind of like in air trick mode or stance. Air tricks shouldn't just gain you EXP while out exploring, but should also help build style in combat. Much like in Generations, the player should get a bonus from pressing L2 and R2 at the same time before landing, and the bonus should be dependent on how many tricks were done, and if you have a bad landing, you get less. The game has been compared many times to a Tony Hawk game. Don't be afraid to play that up. The animations could also stand to be slowed down and smoothed out, and the sound effect you get when doing them could also be more pleasing to listen to. The tricks and generations would be the perfect thing to emulate, both animation quality-wise and sound design-wise. Give air tricks brief invincibility frames to give them a bit more combat utility outside of building style and the Phantom Rush meter. Remember how I said there was a problem with Stomp? The Stomp combo special move is that problem, because it removes the Stomp cancel from Sonic's repertoire of moves, which removes a lot of the player's freedom and combo flexibility. The move also does way too much damage, and stops time when you use it. It looks really plain, and isn't really cool, which is something I should never say about an attack from Sonic the Hedgehog. The camera angle switching also doesn't do it any favors due to how disorienting it is, similar to Wild Rush. If you're going to keep this move in the future, the input for it needs to be R2 and circle at the same time, instead of just the circle button, which will also give you more room for another attack button. The attacks should look way flashier, for example looking like a spinning tornado dive, and do less damage. Again, damage and enemy health across the board needs to be fine-tuned. Assuming you keep this move in the sequel, this should send airborne enemies back to the ground, and should knock down grounded enemies. Bonus damage should be dealt based on how far they fell to the ground. Quick Cyloop is great. I love that it's a launcher and that it slams enemies down that are already launched. Again, much like all the special moves, it shouldn't be a single button because it's too easy to get on accident. Instead of just triangle during a combo, it should be L2 triangle and circle at the same time. Implementing a style system that encourages varying up at your attacks along with revenge values might make the Quick Cyloop meter unnecessary, so you might need to playtest with and without it to see how players feel. Either way, I think the meter could be more lenient than it is now. I really like how it's handled in the Hedgehog May Cry mod at present. I also like that most enemies in the game can be affected by Cyloop and have their attack patterns and phases messed with by using it. However, I think taking a page out of the Titan fights and allowing Cylooped enemies the capacity to attack you to break free, but irregularly, would be a smart choice to keep the players on their toes. Again, revenge values are a necessity for this kind of game. Auto combo should not be a part of the skill tree, and should not cost skill points because it's an accessibility feature. It should be a toggle in the options menu that the player can turn on or off at any time from the moment they start the game. And damage shouldn't be reduced because if you made a great combat system, a player using auto combos won't reach the heights of someone playing well anyway. If you still want to keep the infinite parry in some capacity, it can be part of the auto combo options, easy mode, or an action mode for beginners. Homing shot is awful. Much like the moves I've talked about before, it's super easy to get on accident. You can't cancel the animation once you start it, the animation is way too long, the orbs lack proper impact and hit stop, it doesn't look all that interesting or flashy, and it has an annoying white flash at the end of it that makes it agitating to look at. Everything wrong with the combat system can be represented in this one move. Instead of R1 then square, it should be R1 and square at the same time. Instead of shooting all the orbs at once, the energy balls should have a delay in between them hitting the enemy that the player can influence, kind of like Dante's and Virgil's summon swords. Also, again, don't change up my camera view. It's very disorienting. Remember, 1.5 seconds is the maximum amount of time these special moves should last. Don't have that awful white flash, have proper hit stop and visual effects on hit, and let me cancel it with my movement options like air boost, stomp, and double jump. Spinslash is cool. It's one of the few moves you can actually be hit while doing, since it doesn't slow down time as much as the other moves like Stomp and Wild Rush in vanilla. The animation could stand to be a bit shorter, and I like that it can be cancelled like most of the other moves that aren't homing a shot. The button combination should be L2 and X instead of just X. Spinslash being just X means the player can never use the Dropdash in combos, because they'll get this move on accident, which lowers the depth of the combat system, similar to how the combat system depth was lowered when you pick up the combo Stomp from the skill tree. I think combining Spinslash and the Blue Tornado from Heroes into a single attack, and making it function similarly to Dante's Round Trip would be a good way to make this move stand out. Have it disable certain shields like in Heroes, and have a slight damage over time component. Loop Kick is too similar to Wild Rush. and needs an overhaul. First, the animation should replace the loop with Sonic charging up into a larging lightning kick or a dive kick. The animation again needs to be shorter. Next, the button combination should be R1 and circle at the same time instead of R1 and then circle. For the same reasons, other moves need to be changed to this format. Kick also needs utility that makes it different from Wild Rush. It's not enough to look cool, it needs to have practical applications, like pushing the enemy away, or giving Sonic some kind of buff, or the enemy some kind of debuff. A big problem the vanilla game has is that aside from Cyclone Kick and Cyloop, all the moves do the same thing, which is just damage, and they all stop or slow down time and prevent enemies from attacking you. Grand Slam is largely fine as is, except for the damage. The animation is cool, and it requires you to press multiple buttons at once, so you're unlikely to get it on accident, though you should change the input to square and X at the same time to accommodate the Cyloop and quick Cyloop change. Grand Slam only really needs to be changed on bosses and the supersonic fights, because it's a glorified cutscene, and it's the same animation every time. Maybe make 2 to 3 Grand Slam animations per boss in the future, and make them a smidge shorter. You want to keep the player in the action as much as possible without ripping control away from them, which is why I'm so hard on attacks like Homing Shot being as bad as they are. If you really wanted to, you can make a unique Grand Slam animation per enemy and unique effects on each enemy, and make it harder by requiring multiple successful parries to activate to make it more like Nero's Buster in Devil May Cry, which would also get players more interested in trying it on every enemy in the game. If it's going to be unique per enemy, having a longer Grand Slam animation would be fine. Recovery Smash should just not exist. Don't reward me with insane damage for getting hit. The window may be small, but it still doesn't make any sense to have a move like this in any combat system. Cyclone Kick is great. It looks good and feels good canceling the animation with dodge and parry to go into another attack earlier. More wind-related attacks for Sonic, please. It's his thing, and makes him stand out compared to Blaze's fire powers, Shadow's chaos powers, Silver's psychokinesis, and Tails' technology. It has AoE launch utility other moves in the game lack. The AoE radius could stand to be a bit bigger, and it should have more properties associated with it to make it stand out from Spinslash. Whichever one is better for disabling enemies should do less damage. While I did say the cinematic camera angle switch for this move is fine earlier, I'd be lying if I said that it didn't look way better without it. While on this topic, I should bring up that the Hedgehog May Cry mod removes most of the cinematic camera angles from the combat, and the game looks way better and is more fun to play for this change. For base Sonic, the cinematic camera being removed for Super Sonic was actually not a good call, because of how tiny Sonic is. In comparison to the larger-than-life enemies that he's fighting, you can hardly see him. In fact, Sonic's attacks look pathetic next to these giant enemies when you take away the cinematic camera, but in normal gameplay, looks great. Cross Slash is terrible and should be removed from the game and replaced with something else. It does way too much damage, builds the combo meter insanely fast, animation-wise is derivative of a move Sonic already does in Sonic Boom, while also looking less cool because Ki Blasts from your hands doesn't really fit Sonic's character. It's more in line with Surge and Silver, and the move is also better than Sonic Boom because you're still able to strafe while doing it. If you want to repurpose this move for another character, like say Surge the Tenric, who is a character I hope makes it into the next game, at least as a boss fight, along with several of the other characters introduced in the IDW comics, like Rough and Tumble, that's fine. In fact, I think this move would suit her more and be a good replacement for Sonic Boom. But it should still do way less damage than this. Remember, these ranged moves are supposed to be the equivalent of Dante's and Bayonetta's guns, or Batman's gadgets. They are there to help you maintain flow and keep your style meter up, not do absurd damage. As for other special moves or utility I'd like to see added, bring back Sonic Wind as an AoE stun or an AoE root that stops enemies from jumping or flying around while it's active, but does minimal damage over time. I also miss having something like the light speed attack as something I could do in normal gameplay. It's kind of back in the form of the Sumo fight, but I would like to be able to do something similar while fighting other enemies. And of course, without having to wait a minute to charge to use it, like in SA1 and 2. And in the case of SA2, it couldn't be used on bosses, so it was effectively pointless. A friction-based fire move or two that does damage over time to spice things up, so it's not all wind attacks and movie Sonic Lightning. Rapid-fire consecutive punches and kicks to emphasize Sonic's high speed. A full-on time stop you have to build up to that can be ignored by specific bosses, like say Metal Sonic and Shadow. Specific bosses that can still move while time is stopped is always hype. It was hype in JoJo, and is still hype in the Sonic movie. I have to specify certain bosses, because if you do it for all of them, it loses its impact. As for how big the skill list should be, I think the player should be getting a new tool to play around with, either combat or movement-wise, let's say about every 30 to 45 minutes. So assuming the next game is 20 to 30 hours long, like this one is, which I honestly believe to be the perfect length for a Sonic game, let's say 40 combat-related moves including new combos, and 10 movement-related upgrades. Also remember to start Sonic with more than just the default of this game. While overloading the player with options early on can be an issue, a far worse issue to have is to have too little that you can do, like in the start of Frontiers where your combat options are way too limited, and the end game of Frontiers where I felt like I should still have been getting new moves, but wasn't. I often compare the way Sonic plays in this game to a Metal Gear Rising DLC character like Jetstream Sam. Sam and Sonic can't do as many things as Raiden, but what they can do is fun and different enough from what Raiden does that it's not immediately obvious just how much less complex they are. Sonic's issue being that you are expected to play him for an entire 30-hour-long game, whereas Sam is only meant to be played for about 2 to 3 hours. 5 tops. This got me thinking, why doesn't Sonic have a taunt ability similar to Sam's? It would be perfect for Sonic's character given his cocky and impatient nature, and could have similar benefits and downsides to taunts featured in other Platinum games. They can potentially leave you vulnerable, increase the damage you take, make enemies' attack patterns more difficult to defend against, but raise your style meter or combo meter much faster, make enemies take more damage, on top of being a new combo cancel tool to add to the player's arsenal. Once you get Sonic right, I'd like to see you add more playable characters. At the time of recording this, the Tails, Knuckles, and Amy DLC is not out yet, and we don't know the scope and scale of what DLC 3 is adding. Just don't make the mistake that Adventure 1, 2, and Unleashed made. Characters should play slightly differently from Sonic, but it shouldn't feel like I'm playing a completely different game. And they should be optional for the most part, like they were in the classic games, the advanced games, and Sonic and the Black Knight. I say for the most part because there is a moment in the story that would have been way more impactful if we got to play as the other characters. But I'll bring that up again once we get to the story and pacing section of the video. In the advanced games, everyone was fast, but they had little nuances that made everyone different. Knuckles could climb and glide, Tails could fly and had a tail attack, Cream could fly faster but not as long as Tails, and had a distance attack thanks to cheese, etc. No one wanted to play Big and Amy in SA1, not because they were bad characters, but because they were vastly different from the other gameplay styles, on top of feeling worse to move around as. When done correctly, you're still running through stages, still fighting enemies, but it's the nuances and changes between them that people attach themselves to. The furthest you can deviate from Sonic's base playstyle is the same amount of variance from Dante, Nero, and V. Now, an issue I and many others have complained about was that everyone was just outright better or more interesting than Sonic back in those days, thanks to their unique tools or interesting powers, while you forgot to give Sonic anything of substance. but so long as you listen to my advice of emphasizing Sonic's mastery over the wind and unique mobility, in the same way Blaze has mastery over fire, you will be 100% fine. Again, look at Swift Master and Chun-Li for what to do, as well as Spark the Electric Jester. They ooze the kind of energy a Sonic fighting style should have. As for other characters, you already have a lot of reference material in Sonic Battle and the comics, especially for characters like Tails, Shadow, and Cream. You can even draw inspiration from Sonic Adventure 2's multiplayer special moves like Thunder Arrow for Knuckles. Yes, I know he used that in his boss fight, but you see it more in the multiplayer. The combat for characters other than Sonic don't need to have the same level of complexity that I suggested for the Blue Blur. Again, Jetstream Sam's moveset is nowhere near as robust as Raiden's, but these new combat styles do still need to be fun in their own right, and the number of combos and special moves they have should be relative to how much they are going to be played within the main campaign or in side missions. A character that's only going to be played for about a combined total of 4 hours or so doesn't need to have 60 different attacks and movement options like Sonic or Dante, because they aren't going to be playable for the majority of the game. But the options they do have do need to be distinct from Sonic, which is what Sam and V do really well. Now that's enough about the combat system itself. Let's talk about the enemy design. Now that you have these enemies, don't throw them away. Bring them back with improvements, retool, reskin, and reuse them for future games, while adding new enemy types as well. You already have an in-story reason for why these robot fighting styles can return bigger and better than ever, in the form of Dr. Eggman, so don't let that potential go to waste. If I say an enemy is bad and needs work, don't toss the enemy into the trash. Understand why it didn't work and make it better and more fun to fight in the sequel. The problem Sonic games have had is that there are good ideas that just weren't fleshed out enough, but instead of polishing those ideas, they were thrown away by the time of the next new title. Many of the enemies in Devil May Cry 5 came from previous DMC games, but were improved to be more fun to fight. A lot of my advice in a moment is going to include these enemies would be better if they were encountered in a group with other enemy types attacking as well. Make sure to limit the amount of things that can attack you simultaneously on screen to about 3 or 4. Also borrow the Devil May Cry camera trick of turning off the AIs of enemies that aren't currently on screen to avoid annoying the player. In the Batman Arkham games, enemies attack you one at a time, generally, and occasionally attack with 2 to 3 simultaneously, and that is to ensure the player never gets too overwhelmed despite being one character fighting upwards of 20 plus people at once. Soldier is okay. They could stand to have more health and be a bit more aggressive. I could see them reworked to be the basis of a new Eggpon, Zeddy, or Black Arms Grunt type enemy. I don't really agree that the soldiers don't really fit Sonic design-wise, but I do agree that I wish they were a bit more interesting looking and more varied. This was the perfect opportunity to reintroduce the Gizoids to the story, now that Sonic Chronicles The Dark Brotherhood is hard confirmed to be non-canon. I was really hoping we'd get some connection between the Gizoids and the Ancients, and it sadly never came. Even more disappointing since prototype Gizoids would have been perfect as foot soldiers to be fought throughout an entire game, mimicking the abilities of Sonic's friends and enemies, but on a much weaker scale to set them apart from Emerald, Fi, and Metal Sonic, who can mimic their opponents perfectly. Bubble is neat in concept, but it doesn't do much. It has the one attack in the form of the electric shield, and that's it. Whenever you encounter one, it's always by itself. Spice it up, mix and match enemy type formations. A fight can change drastically just based on what types of enemies you are fighting at one time. You should have more than just the one attack. It should split itself apart and have those pieces attack you either by ramming you, which you can parry, or firing lasers, which the player has to dodge. It also repairs its shield of bubbles too quickly and too often. In fact, you can get into a loop if you're unlucky of the bubbles regenning faster than Sonic Boom can destroy them. In the vanilla game, if I see this thing, I am always going to Sonic Boom it, but if there were other things there and a style system that rewarded me for changing things up, this enemy could go from a 5 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10. Maybe it could be reskinned to be the new version of the Artificial Chaos. Also, don't give the core too much health like the Hedgehog May Cry mod does at the time of me recording this voiceover. Too little health and the combat becomes dull, like in the current state of the game, but too much health and fights become a slog, especially when the combat is too basic. This is again why I said the red seeds of power need to go, so you can properly balance enemy health. Shell is one of the better enemies in the game once you understand it. You can Cyloop it to temporarily remove the shield, which could take multiple reps before it dies, or you can get up in its face and parry the blades right before they hit you to knock them away. I dislike how attacking the shell causes Sonic to bounce off. Make it clear that Sonic is doing 0 damage, but don't bounce me away and interrupt my combos. There are other enemies in the game that do this too, and every time they show up, it's annoying. Ninja has a guard mechanic that doesn't bounce the player away, and that feels much more natural. Much like Bubble, Shell would be better if it was encountered with other enemies and not just itself. Being able to break through the guard with Wild Rush, as I suggested earlier, as an alternative to Cylooping, would also make this enemy more fun. A 7 out of 10 enemy that could easily become a 10 out of 10 with tweaking and support from other enemy types. Banger is interesting. You can kill it instantly with Cyloop or attack it once with the homing attack and then parry it once it comes back for revenge, but killing it that way doesn't give you any experience even though it really should, since it requires just as much, if not more, execution from the player. In a way, it reminds you of the scissor enemies from DMC. Banger is another enemy that suffers from always being fought on its own instead of in a group. 5 out of 10 right now, but I could see it being a 9 out of 10 if it was encountered with other bangers and other enemy types. This is an enemy that should show up as support for other more substantial enemies like Bubble and Shell. Enemies that aren't Guardians past this point I don't have names for, so bear with me. This homing attack umbrella type enemy is really good, except for one major flaw. It hijacks my camera whenever I get close to it. Every content creator, every streamer, every person that's encountered this enemy has said the exact same thing. Don't take away my camera control like this, ever. You could reskin this enemy in future games and make this one change, and no one would mind. As is, it's a 3 out of 10 that I actively try to avoid, but could be a 10 out of 10, and could even fit in the cyberspace stages. There's a couple moments in Rhea Island where this enemy is used in some platforming challenges, and it feels awesome. More of that, please. Emerald Stealers are cute, and actually kinda remind me of the capture bots from Heroes. I wouldn't mind seeing these things be a rare thing you could encounter in various enemy formations. It never happened in my playthrough, but I've seen clips of other players being glitched through the floor after being attacked by it. So that needs to be fixed. It's difficult to rate them in their current state because they aren't really a thing you actively fight like the rest of the enemies in this game. If you implement them into enemy formations, give them miniguns that chip away at your rings kind of like the guns in 06. Have them constantly emit the grind trails so that you can get to them and stomp them at any time, and have them attempt to capture you briefly so other enemies can wail on you, this spot would be an easy 10 out of 10. Ares Island soldiers suck to fight. They counter your homing attack with their shield by bouncing you back and constantly interrupt your flow. You have to Cyloop them to get rid of it, but it doesn't stay gone long if you use the quick Cyloop. Or you have to attack them with a special move first. Imagine if in Arkham City you fought an enemy group and every single one of them had a shield. That's what fighting soldiers is like from this point on. There should be ways to break their shields other than just Cyloop, and attacking them without Cyloop and other special moves shouldn't bounce me back. Instead, it should just clash like when fighting Ninja and its variants. This enemy is a 3 out of 10 as is. The Ares Island snipers are cool, but much like every other normal enemy in the game, suffers because you are only ever fighting one at a time. Except at one point on Rhea Island where it snipes you from afar while you're fighting fodder, which was a fun experience. I wish it happened more often. 6 out of 10, but could easily be ranked higher if encountered in a group. The spring enemy is cute, and I love that it exists. It's really easy to destroy, but in a group I could see it becoming really fun to fight. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10 simply for being unique enough to stand out, but could be rated higher if fought with other enemies. Chaos Island soldiers are annoying for the same reason as the ones on Ares. I do like the ground spike move they have. Change the annoying bounce back shields and they would be great. 2 out of 10. The Chaos Island bird is a cool idea for Traversal, but I don't think they would be all that fun to fight in groups unless you made riding them similar to riding a Titan in the Batman Arkham games, where you can use its attacks to fight other enemies and ram them. I'd also like it if riding it around the islands were twice as fast and it took longer to descend. As is, this enemy is a 5 out of 10. Interesting, but could use some work. I could also see them being reskinned for more Black Arm soldiers if you decide to bring them back. The Black Hawk and its variants in particular. I would really like to see the Black Arms and gun come back in some capacity in future games, because Ian Flynn did some amazing stuff with them in the Archie comics, and kind of reinforces the idea there is no such thing as an outright bad Sonic concept or character, just ones that weren't fleshed out enough. The Ouranos soldiers have the same problems as the others, except now homing attacking their shields hurts you. Please stop doing this. It makes them really annoying to fight. Pretty much every fight with soldiers past Kronos turns into a Cyloop fest, because they will always put up their shield if you start an encounter with a homing attack. The red blob enemy is really cool. You have to stomp it 3 times or it will drown you. I love to see this thing come back as part of more platforming sequences. Maybe have it start drowning the player as soon as you get in it, because the drowning music is so rare. The dogs are the worst normal type enemy in the game. Remember how I praised how you are never forced to fight enemies in this game? The dogs break that rule. They will circle you, and you can't escape. And if you take too long to kill them, they instant kill you. You can technically avoid them, but I've never done so intentionally, which is a huge issue. They kind of remind me of the DMC blitzes, except worse in every way. It would be so much better if you had to engage with them first before they run that circle around you. But them coming out of nowhere for their ambushes and changing your camera view like the balloons makes them a 1 out of 10. If you fix these issues along with my complaints about the parry, give us some ways to disengage if we encounter them, have this enemy type show up as a part of other enemy groups, remove the instant kill component, and let me keep control of my camera, they could also be an 8 or 9 out of 10. The Guardian mini-bosses are where I feel the game's combat is at its most fun. The amount of gears you can get from them should vary based on the amount of time a player is expected to spend on them. It sucks that the longer bosses in the game, like Shark and Spider, give the same amount of gears as Ninja, which disincentivizes the player from fighting them after they've done that once already, especially when Big's fishing exists. They also don't always give experience points for beating them, and they really should. Maybe give extra EXP and gears based on your style rating throughout the boss. Also, I understand that gears probably won't return in the sequel. It'll probably be some other collectible that is used to access levels, as I don't see CyberSpace itself returning in future games, but I do see the 3D levels coming back. Ninja and its variants, Shinobi, Kunuchi, and Master Ninja are really fun to fight. They could use more health and could stand to be a bit more aggressive, but they all range from 7 out of 10 to 9 out of 10. And my opinion of them has only improved after fighting them with the Hedgehog May Cry mod on, which greatly improves the combat experience in most areas. Tower and its variants, Excavator, Red Pillar, and Silver Hammer, are great. I love that there are different ways to fight it. The only part that needs to take damage is the head, and you can go about it in any way you wish. You can melee attack the pieces of its body one at a time, but it's the slowest way. You can Cyloop the bottom and destroy the pieces, which is faster. You can wait for the ring to be low, and then wall run up its body right to the head, which is even faster, or you can use your terrain to find a way up to the head that way, which feels even more rewarding when you do this with either the Beats Improved Physics mod or the Hedgehog May Cry mod. Tower is awesome, and I'm going to give it and all its variants a 9 out of 10. Asura is a boss I want to like, but it's just too jank. I like the idea of climbing up and running up the boss. That aspect is really cool, but the blue and red boosters pushing me around and the jank that comes from that makes this boss not fun to engage with. On top of that, there's the glitchy collision detection, which sometimes results in falling through the top of the boss, which only hurts it more. The hit detection on the orbs and shields are also inconsistent with their effects, and can blindside you. It's very hard to tell when you will and won't be hit. I do like that you can get extra gears for Cylooping the legs, and I wish more Guardians had unique hidden interactions like this for extra gears. We're at a 10 for right now, but the potential for a 9 out of 10 with tweaking is there. Get rid of the boosters. Don't have the boss slam its arms while you're on top of it to help mitigate the collision issues. Slow the red orbs on the boss down, but make them more frequent and parryable. Replace the laser gate with something else, or make them whiter. Squid is cool. The spectacle is nice, but having to redo the running phase if you don't do the combat phase fast enough makes it not fun sometimes. Make the running phase more difficult by having Squid shoot more projectiles and be more aggressive when you're far away, but make Squid stop shooting when you're at certain camera angles and when you're really close to it, because the shots are really difficult to dodge at close range. This would make the fight way more enjoyable. When in the boss phase, Squid will do one of two things: attack with its arms or put up a shield. Give Squid more attacks during the boss phase, give it a few extra allies to help defend it during this portion of the fight, and make sure it stays in the boss phase while you either fall off or it dies. Give it attacks that will try to push you off but are very obvious and telegraphed. As it is, it's a 7 out of 10, but could be an easy 10 out of 10 with these tweaks. Strider sucks. It's the worst Guardian mini-boss in the game. The grinding phase goes on for too long, its legs can obscure your view of its projectiles because of the camera angle. Having to do the grinding phase again if you don't kill it soon enough is not fun. You also can't jump over its projectiles because you aren't locked to the plane the rails are on. The boss can also only attack you during the rail phase. Give some attacks for when you aren't on the rails, you know, when you're walking up to it, and for when you are in the combat phase, like I suggested with Squid. Fix these issues, make the boss phase last until you fall or are pushed off, and give the boss enemies to help protect it during the combat phase, and this boss can go from a 1 out of 10 to an 8 or a 9. Tank is fun once you understand how it works. Tank's major problem is that it's not immediately clear what it wants from you. Pretty much everyone that dislikes this fight dislikes it because they can't figure out how it works, and I don't blame them. Instead of having it spin around with its flame jets to damage you, just have it shoot projectiles at you, and then make it clearer when the player should be and shouldn't be homing attacking. It's an 8 out of 10 fight as is, but has the potential for a 10 out of 10 with more clarity. This is one of the few boss fights I like fighting less in the Hedgehog May Cry mod, because it makes the Sandstorm phase go on for way too long, and makes the clunkiness of the homing attack during this section of the fight more apparent. Shark is a cool boss that goes on for too long. You'll probably only want to fight it once because the tail sequence goes on forever and isn't all that engaging of a QTE. It's basically the same thing every time, and you have to redo the tail sequence anytime you mess up, or fail to kill it in one cycle. To be fair, you don't have to redo the entire sequence if you're knocked off, but it's still annoying since there's so little input from the player during these moments. The tail sequence should only have to be done once. The input should be more frequent so the player isn't just sitting there watching a cutscene. Failing a QTE should damage you instead of knocking you off, and the duration of the QuickTime event sequence should be cut in half. You'll also notice during this footage I was once again having problems with this game's lock-on system. Shark should have an actual battle phase like Squid, and have attacks that it can do. 5 out of 10 as is, but has the potential for an easy 10 out of 10. Sumo is really fun. and you basically don't need to change anything. You knocked it out of the park on your first attempt. The only change I'd maybe make is make it more aggressive at the start and also give it more attacks. 9 out of 10, easy. It's actually another one of the few enemies I like fighting less in Hedgehog May Cry because that mod gives it too much health. Also, this boss being a recreation of the Zero fight from Sonic Adventure 1, but way more interesting, was not lost on me, Sonic Team. I saw what you did here, and I really appreciate it. Fortress is the second worst mini-boss in the game. It's a joke. It's a worse version of Squid, and has even less of a chance of actually killing you. It has other phases that I had never seen until I played through with Hedgehog May Cry, because I always killed it in one cycle, which would be great if the first cycle had any challenge or interesting mechanics at all. I would shed no tears if this enemy never came back. The second cycle is slightly more interesting, and probably should have been what you start with, but I kept clipping through the boss during the damage phase of the second cycle. So all around, even with mods, this boss is still terrible. Spider is another great mini-boss thanks to the music and spectacle. The first phase could stand to be a bit more dangerous, but the skydiving phase is really fun. Maybe have 2 to 3 more randomized skydiving patterns and make the third and final phase more dangerous, but less mobile so you don't accidentally spam homing attack, which probably won't even be an issue in the sequel with more than one attack button, but otherwise, we have another winner, 9 out of 10. Caterpillar is a better designed version of Strider in literally every way. I don't think I really need to say more than that. 7 out of 10. There's a bit of an issue with depth perception here. It's hard to see what plane the orbs are on when they are in the air. There's a little bit of jank when trying to double jump and turn around on the rails, and if you stomp on a rail, you will always be going forward rather than where Sonic had been facing prior to the stomp. The lock-on continues to be a big problem for this game. Caterpillar only has one homing attack point, which can make attacking it annoying. For enemies that are significantly bigger than base Sonic, like Caterpillar, Shark, etc., there should be a homing attack point on every side, and most of its body should have a hurt box, so that the player does not have to fumble around to do damage. This would also go a long way towards making the lock-on system less annoying. Gripes aside, this is still a fun fight. Ghost is another incredible enemy, and one of the best in the entire game. Instead of those stupid tile puzzles and other gimmicks that just don't fit the kinetic energy a Sonic game should provide, more fights with Ghost throughout the game, please. I love these platforming challenge fights that have dynamic music, like Perfect Chaos in Sonic Generations, and Ghost in this game. The sound design and music really sells this fight. No, really, more of these throughout the entire game for the sequel. My rating for Ghost is an easy 10 out of 10. Now on to the Titan Supersonic fights. These are the best parts of the game, so long as you don't know you can hold down the parry and aren't over-leveled. I'm going to try to stop harping on this issue with the parry going forward, just to assume it's going to be a problem on every level, so that we can avoid repetition, but it really does need to be changed. When you get hit by a Titan, it takes a bit too long for the camera to focus back on the Titan again, and there are a lot of moments where you can clip inside a Titan which are jarring. Also, the checkpoints for these fights are pretty bad. Don't start me back at the climbing phase. Start me at the supersonic portion if I die, and start me at max rings. Make the climbing phase more difficult and intricate. In other words, don't put boosters on Giganto that let me skip 80% of the climb. I'll also be basing my rankings on the Hedgehog May Cry mod. As for Supersonic, this is the most fun Supersonic has ever been. It was a smart design choice to give Supersonic the same moveset as Base Sonic, but exaggerated, and I hope this carries over into all games going forward. Supersonic always being in an airborne state might cause problems with my suggested changes to the combat, like multiple attack buttons and variants between ground and air combos, but I'm sure you'll figure something out. Or maybe it won't be as big an issue as I feel it could be. In the sequel, you could tie Supersonic's flight to the L3 button, and replacing the Lightspeed Dash with flight while in super form, then give every Titan boss a kneeling state where it would be possible to do ground combos, which is something that's actually already in Frontiers after you Cyloop Giganto, Knight, or Supreme twice. I imagine it would work similarly to how flying works in the 3D Dragon Ball games, like Tenkaichi 3 and Xenoverse 2. This would also make it easier to implement Supersonic in non-boss fight situations, like in the open zone and in cyberspace, which is something a lot of players have requested. Re-roaming as Supersonic would be really fun, and would also be a nice reward for 100%ing the game. One last thing. My opinions for everything Hedgehog May Cry related were based on version 2.2, which is definitely not the version that will be out when this video sees the light of day, and also won't be representative of my footage, since footage tends to be the last thing I get in the video making process. I'll put on screen now what version I'll be using for this footage. Giganto is incredible. Undefeatable is one of my favorite songs in the game, a great first boss that I only wish had a couple more attacks. The climbing phase could have been more intense and intricate, and I wish the boosters just didn't exist, as I already mentioned, because they cheapen the thrill of the climb. Sonic Team, you have a huge issue with automation in your games, and you need to stop. Trust your players to want to play your game, and your game to be in a playable state. Wyvern is probably my favorite boss in the game. The music is incredible, and the spectacle of flying through the entire map is unlike anything I've ever played. The loading screens in between QuickTime events does hurt it a bit. Fix that and this would be an easy 10 out of 10, as it is now all rated a 9. Knight is another great fight. Riding the shield is fun, aiming the shield in phase 2 is cool. Getting knocked back in a cutscene here actually feels less annoying than it felt in previous fights, and the load screens are better masked. I would have probably liked this fight my first run more, if not for the fact of the red seeds of power, which made me do so much damage that I crushed it in no time. Seriously, damage should not be something I upgrade throughout the game. Ring capacity, sure. Health, sure. Defense, sure. New moves, fine, but never damage. You can't balance a character action game like that. It never works. Knight gets a 9 out of 10 from me. Supreme is terrible. It's a worse Giganto, and has so little health that I spent large portions of the fight waiting for the next phase, because I did too much damage in a short period of time on my initial playthrough. It's never clear what the game actually wants you to do. The projectiles it shoots aren't threatening, it just reminds me of the Sonic Unleashed experience. The spectacle of the previous 3 fights is just kinda gone. The lock-on really needs to be improved across the board. Throughout the entire game, I'd had issues with the imprecise lock-on, but Supreme brought those issues to the forefront. The game wants you to target the turrets and destroy them, but it's such a pain to do so because of the lock-on system. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't work. I'll lock on to the turrets, and then Sonic will fly off and attack the Supreme anyway. You're better off just mashing your face into the Supreme until it dies. A very disappointing last boss to end on. 3 out of 10 in vanilla, I guess 5 or 6 out of 10 with Hedgehog May Cry. This is not a good fight to end on. The End is a fascinating villain that I hope comes back in future games. It's kind of like the Sonic equivalent of Dark Matter and Zero from Kirby and Darkseid from the DC universe. But this boss is, it's not bad, it's just disappointing. This should have been another Supersonic fight. It should have been this massive spectacle with cool mechanics like the others before it, like a chase to the End's current physical form, but you are constantly dealing with hazards and lasers the End is spawning to try and create a distance between you and it. Kind of like the fights with Dark Gaia and Perfect Dark Gaia in Unleashed, though more fast-paced and better designed, because controlling the Gaia Colossus didn't feel very good, and the part where you fight the Dark Gaia's tentacles isn't all that engaging in that game. Maybe at certain thresholds, the End creates a construct you have to fight, and you fight it similarly to previous Titans. But instead of anything cool or interesting, the fight is just the hacking minigame again, but you can move up and down. It's a really disappointing thing to end on gameplay-wise. It's nice to feel like Sonic has a rogues gallery with different factions again. Eggman, Metal Sonic, and Sage for the Eggman Empire, Zabak and the Zeti, Clutch with Rough and Tumble as his goons, the potential return of the Black Arms, which has me really excited, Mimic, the Babylon Rogues, even though I don't really see them as villains. They're much more like Catwoman in Rouge. And now, the end. Now that the Titan battles are done with, let's talk about the kind of bosses I really want to see in a sequel. Character battles. Now that we are finally getting a good combat system in a Sonic game, I want to have bosses Sonic size that are fun to fight, and have spectacle on the level of the Supersonic fights, and other character action games like Metal Gear Rising fights with the Winds of Destruction, Jetstream Sam and Monsoon in particular, and the Virgil or Dante fights in Devil May Cry games. I'd like one final Sonic vs. Shadow fight that's just a sight to behold. Now give them an actual good reason to fight, of course, that makes sense. It could be a friendly brawl or sparring match between equal rivals, or a serious match over how to handle a moral dilemma, like in issue 6 of IDW, or their fights in Sonic Battle. I'll be happy as long as the reason for the fight makes sense, and it's nothing like this nonsense in Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric.
Not so fast, Sonic.
Shadow, what are you doing here?
Not a great time, Shadow. A little busy saving the world.
Saving the world? You don't make me laugh. You're weak. And you know what makes you weak? Your loyalty to your pathetic friends. You're not going through it. I'm gonna show you just how weak you are.
Or every other Shadow appearance in IDW past his debut. A Tails boss featuring a lot of his moves from Sonic Battle to show how far he's come since the old days. Knuckles deserves a proper 3D boss fight after how much of a joke his Adventure 1 fight was. A Surgeon Kit boss fight would be incredible. Quite literally everyone would want to play that, and unlike Shadow, you don't have to come up with a good reason for them to fight, because their default emotions are kill Sonic on sight. Rough and Tumble along with Clutch Opossum for obvious reasons, and of course my favorite character in all of Sonic, Metal Sonic. If we could have an excellent final or semi-final boss with him as a character battle, I'd be tempted to rate the game a 10 out of 10 just on principle, if it's anything as good as the Virgil fights in DMC 5 or 3. I really appreciate how much more respect and love Metal Sonic has been getting in IDW as of late. He was the main antagonist of the first arc, is a large part of why the heroes managed to beat Zavok in Metal Virus. On top of having one of the best moments in Sonic history in the annual issues, fights Shadow to a standstill and even technically wins, curb stomps Surge in their first encounter, and Sonic and Tails even admit they are unsure if they can take Metal Sonic at different points in the book. And that's how it should be. The appeal and strength of Metal Sonic as a character is that he's a Darth Vader-esque figure, someone that's such a wrecking ball of destruction, hard to even hurt or run away from, and how rarely they communicate anything other than rage and contempt that they are almost horror movie villain-like in their presence. Alright, I put it off long enough, let's talk about CyberSpace. I'm not going to mince words. CyberSpace is terrible, but not unsalvageable. The controls in these stages are way too stiff and imprecise. I never feel like I am truly in control of my actions, and Sonic's weight is all wrong, which are huge issues to have for a 3D platformer. CyberSpace stages have their own controls and feel that is wildly different from the open zone that can't be edited in any way. This was a mistake, and I am begging you to not make the same mistake in the sequels. You are never going to get a consensus on how Sonic should control in 3D with 100% accuracy, so putting it in the hands of the player for the open zone was the correct choice, and it also would have been the correct choice for CyberSpace. Some people are going to like the Beats physics mod. Some will hate it. Some will hate the Hedgehog May Cry physics changes, while others will love it. Giving the player more control over how Sonic controls is the answer. More sliders and accessibility options for slope resistance for going uphill and downhill. Some people hate how Sonic stops on a dime, but I love it. How do you fix that? More accessibility sliders. I've stated many times, I can't stand how Sonic's speed is instantly killed when you jump, while for others, it makes platforming more manageable for them. The answer will always be more accessibility sliders. Visually, these levels all blend together in my head. Outside of 1-2, which I remember for its difficulty, and 3-5, which I remember for being the worst level in the entire game, I don't really remember much about them because they all use the same 4 level themes. Green Hill, which I was already sick of because you've used it too much. Chemical Plant, which I'm sick of because you've used it too much. Sky Sanctuary, which I wasn't sick of prior to this game, but now I am. And the Cyberspace City theme, which isn't used very often. If you're going to reuse level themes from previous games, they need to be from things we haven't seen in a long time, or your audience will get fatigued. Even new players are going to get sick of these visuals because these 4 themes are all they are going to see. In the future, there should be at least 7 or so unique themes for these levels. I was waiting for a callback to Final Rush from Sonic Adventure 2 or Stardust Speedway's environment, since you have those assets in Sonic Generations. In fact, these levels being recreations of past levels is never fully capitalized on. You could have mixed and matched several different level designs, which would have also extended the length of some of these stages that are a bit too short. Then there's the 2D stages, which are awful. Every single one of them is irredeemably bad. I don't know how this keeps happening, but the 2D stages in 3D Sonic games made by Sonic Team have just been getting worse and worse since Generations. You need to invest in proper physics if you're going to insist on bringing 2D back in the next game. I shouldn't constantly be getting stuck on the terrain, my drop dash shouldn't constantly glitch out and kill all my speed in an instant. I shouldn't struggle to run through loops or curl into a ball. These loops shouldn't be so scripted and rigid that they break at the drop of a hat. These are issues that didn't exist in the classic games decades ago, or Sonic Adventure 1 and 2. They weren't a problem in the advanced games. They shouldn't be a problem here. Either actually invest in making this aspect of the game play like they used to, or don't bother wasting resources on this at all. The people that want 3D gameplay are unhappy because they wanted actual 3D in their 3D Sonic game, and the people that like 2D aren't happy because it plays objectively worse than prior 2D games. The only people who might like these are people who have literally never touched a Sonic game before, or a platformer, so they don't have a frame of reference for what is and isn't good design. There are 2 things that salvages these cyberspace levels, and it's the Magnet Dash, aka the homing attack air boost cancel, which makes speedrunning the 3D stages a ton of fun, and the music, which encouraged me to play all these stages just to hear what Otani-san came up with, even if I wasn't having fun with the stages. That said, the boost audio filter does hurt my ability to enjoy the music, which is why I always use the Hedgehog Manager to turn it off. So I would appreciate the ability to turn off the boost audio filter in the options in the future games. While definitely not intended by the developers, much like the momentum rail jumps, I am very happy the Magnet Dash is in the game, and even happier that Sonic Team seems to be embracing both. Now, in terms of level design difficulty for these stages, the difficulty is just about right. I'll be going into this a bit more in depth when I start talking about every stage individually, but there are only a handful of moments where a stage's design frustrated me. Unfortunately, there is one last aspect of cyberspace where you guys fumbled, and that's the S-rank requirements. S-rank should mean something. They're supposed to be emblematic of mastering a level, and for the first 2 stages, that feels accurate, and then the rest of the S-ranks are a complete joke. Many of the cyberspace stages, I completed all the objectives on my first attempt. Now, when it comes to balancing for S-ranks, the metric for what an S-rank should be based on complete mastery of the level, with a near-perfect run, with all the top speed sliders at max, with about a 5 to 10 second margin for error. Now, there are 2 mods that make the cyberspace stages actually fun. Hedgehog May Cry, or the Beats Physics mod, which, again, while not perfect, actually makes controlling Sonic in these stages significantly more fun, and the Balanced S-Ranks mod by YSF Booms, which makes all the S-Rank times closer to the difficulty to 1-2, and has settings for improved physics in mind. For fun, I've decided I'm going to go through the arcade mode with both these mods on, and detail my experience with them, but only for the 3D stages. As I stated earlier, the 2D stages are irredeemable, and even with these mods improving how the game feels for me to play, the terrain and how Sonic acts on it is largely unchanged. Stage 1-1 is a alright tutorial for getting the player used to how Sonic moves around, and getting them in that speedrun mindset. While killing enemies is fast with this mod, it is still faster to find ways to skip over them by using well-timed momentum jumps and air dashes, as well as magnet dashes. Hitting springs, dash pads, and pulleys helps the player course correct, but slows them down, which is something I really liked about the vanilla game. The S-rank time is as tight as it should be. You can only really afford to make a mistake before the S-rank is unobtainable, and that's how an S-rank should be, a really basic level carried by its S-rank difficulty. Pretty much everything I said about 1-1 is appropriate for 1-2. I do dislike the 5 seconds of automation at the start of the stage, as it makes replaying the stage a ton, which you're going to do due to how tight the S-rank time is, tedious. Please don't start your stages like this. I think the S-rank time could have been lowered to even 40 seconds, again giving my experience based on the mods. In vanilla, the bottom path is objectively faster, which flies in the face of how Sonic level design used to work. The top path being faster, but harder to stay on, while the bottom path being slower and more dangerous. But there are still opportunities to get back to the top route. There's this weird hitch on the top path that kills my jump speed that I can only theorize is due to the speed booster. In general, I wish there were less dash pads and boosters, not just in cyberspace, but in general. This has been a criticism of a lot of 3D Sonic games for a while, and I stand by it. Please use less automation, less dash pads, less scripted sequences, just let me control the character. There was a moment on the last island where I almost soft-locked myself twice, because I had the audacity to turn around on a scripted dash pad before a loop. I got out the first time through blind luck and mashing. The second time, I remembered I had the fast travel system, which I wouldn't have access to if I didn't do big fishing beforehand. In other words, this would have been a place I could have soft-locked myself. Stuff like this is why Sonic fans have been complaining about the games not having proper physics and momentum for years. Occasional hoop rings, springs, corkscrews, and loop-de-loops are fine, especially now that the game makes it clear avoiding them is how you get faster times. In spite of this, the level is still fun due to the strict S-rank timing that requires you to be intimately familiar with the level design. This is the first stage where the player can really take advantage of the magnet dash, and while it is pretty difficult to pull off, it feels incredibly satisfying. The difficulty of performing a technique relative to its utility is an important part of game design. It's again why the infinite parry is universally reviled. I'd also say don't use invisible walls and camera angles to corral the player like in those rail segments. If the player is willingly throwing themselves off into the abyss, that is their prerogative. The invisible walls and camera switches just frustrate and make it more likely for them to accidentally kill themselves. Invisible walls behind goal rings, though, are 100% okay and are actually helpful. 1-4 is okay. It's a retread of modern Green Hill from Sonic Generations, with none of the 2D. It doesn't have nearly the amount of shortcut opportunities, but there are some good skips that can be done with well-placed momentum jumps and magnet dashes. 1-5 is where I started to get really frustrated by the invisible walls and the surprisingly high kill plane. I think a good S-rank time for this stage would have been actually 35 to 40 seconds. I think the more open the level, the more wiggle room should be given to the player, but not so much that the S-rank is basically free. If a player can get an S-rank on their first attempt of a stage, the time is way too lenient. If I was talking about the 2D cyberspace stages, I'd have already talked about this issue in stage 1-3, since that's the first time this issue becomes a problem. 1-2 technically has this issue as well, but the stage is designed in such a way that you are unlikely to encounter it. The issue is the hazards are too hard to see, because they blend in with the stage. You see these spikes? I ran into them because they are too similar in color to everything else around me. In pretty much every Sonic game, spikes are bright white objects that stick out like a sore thumb so that the player can see them and has time to react to them. This is the first Sonic game I've ever played to ever have this specific issue, and it's not relegated to just these two stages. Many of the hazards in CyberSpace are like this. There's another 2D CyberSpace stage that I had to restart around 20 times on stream because I kept running into the same spikes I literally couldn't see even after I hit them over and over again, so I had to memorize where they were. As for the time, it's very clearly meant with the first possible magnet dash in mind, because I have no idea how you would hit sub 20 seconds playing this stage normally. I don't think I'm a fan of the S rank times being based solely off of one moment, regardless of how cool the mechanic is, like the magnet dash. I had a similar issue with Metal Harbor's A rank in SA2. That said, the red rings do incentivize you to replay the level like a normal person at least once. So the make it or break it magnet dash is probably not that big an issue, so long as you tell the player that that's what you want from them. As for the stage itself, it's a shorter version of the SA2 City Escape, so it's hard for me to hate on it, but I also find myself unable to enjoy it since the original was a better experience as a cohesive whole, and it's not as mechanically taxing as 1-2 was. 2-2 felt awesome to play. Short but constantly nerve-wracking. The S-rank time that the mod provided was borderline perfect. I do wish the stage as a whole was double this length, but again, overall, a blast to play through. 2-4, invisible walls and a few weird scripting issues aside, felt really fun to plow through. The S-rank time feels about right, though I do wish the stage was a bit longer, and no, when I say I want it to be longer, that does not mean I want the stage to be full of scripted sequences and automation to pad out the stage length. 1-2 was the perfect length for what it wants from the player, and how many times they are likely going to replay it. In my opinion, the perfect length for a borderline perfect run of a Sonic stage is about anywhere between 40 seconds to 2 minutes for this kind of arcadey speedrun style level design. However, that 40 seconds to 2 minutes should be absolutely jammed packed with decision making on the player's end. Any given Sonic Forces stage might technically be longer than what I just played, but I made more decisions and had more input in that 27 seconds than any level in Sonic Forces. 2-6 was a level that was great in vanilla, and it's even more fun here. I'd rank it just below 1-2. Only really hampered by the weird camera angle switches. It would be nice if the camera angle switches were based on whether you were on the rail at that point or not, rather than just at a certain spot in the level, so that the player has more freedom. (3-1) with these two mods is everything I want in a Sonic level. This was the most fun I've ever had playing a 3D Sonic level, period, since Sonic Generations, and I found getting the S rank here was more satisfying for me than playing this same level in Sonic Adventure 2. It's not perfect. Again, the glitchy terrain and annoying camera angle switches do hurt my enjoyment of this stage a bit, but it's just so close to what I want out of a traditional 3D Sonic level going forward that I don't care. I was close to giving up on this section of the video, because while only 1-5 felt outright bad so far, I wasn't really excited about what I was playing outside of maybe 1-2 and 2-6. 3-1 with these mods revitalized my desire to continue playing and talking about CyberSpace. 3-3 with these mods was pretty enjoyable as well, not to the heights of 3-1, but still really fun. In vanilla, I had no fun with this stage, because all I could think about was just how much more fun this stage was in Generations, which is a problem you are always going to run into when bringing back old stages. If it's not as fun, or more fun than the original, you're just going to upset people. 3-5 is still the worst level in the entire game, even with these mods. I don't know what you guys were thinking. This level wasn't even fun in the game you took it from. but the drift in Frontiers is so abysmal, it makes playing this stage an actively bad experience. Never do anything like this stage again. Unless you want to bring back the drift that was in Sonic Generations as it functioned in Sonic Generations. 4-1 was okay. I think I overall enjoyed the experience of playing the original Metal Harbor from SA2 more, but the physics of Hedgehog May Cry and the Magnet Dash made for a unique experience that was enjoyable in its own right. The S-Rank time could be maybe made a smidge harsher. This is a late game stage, but it didn't take me all that many retries. 4-2, I believe, is the first original 3D level of the game, and it's really good. Even without any mods, this was a level I enjoyed in the vanilla version of the game when I first played. It's nice to see Sonic Team can make fully original level layouts that are fun given enough time and resources. Didn't spy a ton of Magnet Dash opportunities for this recording session, though I'm sure they're there, or slope jump spots, but given that this level was made with Frontier's control scheme in mind, that's not too surprising. Speaking of slope jumps and Magnet Dash opportunities, 4-3 is awesome. With these mods installed, it might be tied with 3-1 for my favorite level in the game. It's so well designed with multiple pathways, chances to save yourself from death everywhere, automation used sparingly. I could gush about this stage for a while. It also exemplifies why the CyberSpace controls being the way they are in vanilla was a mistake. I thought nothing of this level with the default CyberSpace control scheme, but with Hedgehog May Cry on, I could replay this stage just as much as 1-2 without getting bored. The S-Rank time for this stage is way too lax though. It definitely could have been shortened to about 50 seconds. 4-4, much like 4-2, was another level I really liked in vanilla, and I still really liked it with these mods installed. This was the first level since 2-2 where I actually felt how handy the bounce in Frontiers can be. The modded S-Rank time felt perfect. 4-5 is neat. Straight through, I don't think this level is anything special, with or without mods. The joy of this level comes from trying to get the red rings. You may be wondering why I haven't really talked about the red rings much. Well, it's because I plan on talking about it later when we get to the open zone and pacing section of the video. 4-5 is a fun, cozy level that honestly probably should have been earlier in the game given the mood of the last island. 4-7 is solid. It didn't blow me away, but it was still a really fun time with a fairly challenging S-Rank. Another stage I don't really remember all that well in vanilla, but modded I had a pretty fun time. It's been a while since we've had a dud, and 4-4 is certainly one of those. It's really short, and doesn't have very much going on mechanically. Not a lot of places to magnet dash or slope jump. Just homing attack chains, and air boost stomps. It also emphasizes that precision platforming is not, and never will be, Sonic's forte. Sonic's strength is always about flow and maintaining your speed. So when you make him have to perform stomps on buttons on tiny platforms that are really easy to miss, there are going to be issues. A good Sonic level should account for margins of error with next to no automation. You do this by providing the player with wider and longer platforms and occasional homing attack pulleys and springs to help correct themselves if they ever over or undershoot. All the really good levels in this game have that in common, especially 4-3. If you must have precision platforming going forward, steal the orange circle from Crash 4 It's About Time, so the player will always know where they are going to land. One of the biggest reasons for why I hated the Werehog is that I never knew where he would land because there was no drop shadow or circle.
I gotta say, adding that little circle helps so much with portions of the game where you have to platform forward and backwards. It really is a godsend.
When it comes to 4-9, I initially didn't like the skateboard sections, and if I'm being honest, these moments still pale in comparison to the skateboard and snowboard sections of SA1 and 2 and Generations, but I had a good time trying to get the modded S rank time. The process of learning what the game actually wanted me to do to make these sections go by faster, which wasn't something I had to do in vanilla, was enjoyable. The platforming was a tad frustrating, but it did have a nice flow to it once you get good at it. A good level, but didn't have the climactic feeling a final level should have, like Final Rush, Eggman Land, or Chaos Angel Act 1, etc. According to Twitter, this is apparently Lethal Highway from Shadow the Hedgehog, which is an insane pull, but I'm cool with it. I don't hate Shadow the Hedgehog, I liked that game. My many issues with that game aside. Finally, we can start talking about the open zone. I enjoyed my time with it a ton, with a few caveats. First glaring flaw smacks you in the face about 5 seconds of starting Kronos Island. This tutorial is terrible. This is one of the worst examples of tutorialization I have ever seen. The game constantly stops you to say, hey, look at this. Hey, do this. Do you know how to do this thing we already told you about in cyberspace? Oh, you do? Let me take you to this loading screen with this unskippable tutorial so that you can learn again. Here's some basic puzzles that are brain dead easy and have nothing to do with why you would be interested in this game in the first place, and may have actually killed your interest in playing because they gave you a bad first impression of what the puzzles will be like. Here's a slow statue turning puzzle that has no place in an action game, that also makes no sense visually. What the hell is Sonic doing here? If he was using aerokinesis and using wind to move the statue, that would make sense? But he isn't. It's like the designers suddenly thought they were making a game for Silver the Hedgehog, were told otherwise, and forgot to remove this puzzle from the game, because there are no other puzzles like this ever again. Unless this was supposed to prepare the player for the light bouncing puzzle at the end of Kronos, because it didn't do that. There's also the other puzzle, jumping the gun, there's this other puzzle on Ares Island with the missile where it's just hovering above Sonic's hand. If Sonic was, I don't know, spinning his hands to create a tornado and carrying the missile that way, that'd be one thing, but he doesn't. It goes again into my issue with the game really lacks animation polish. That said, I do love the loading screens, where you can practice the mechanics of the game and try out moves a la Bayonetta. Remove the timer on the challenges on the loading screens so the player can actually run through them all, or have the loading screen timers be a toggleable option. In the future, let me try out moves in training mode before I buy them, so that I know if a move that I'm about to buy is what I'm looking for at the time or not. Just like in Devil May Cry 5. Try before you buy is always a good system to have. Also, don't do a loading screen reset whenever I successfully perform a technique. If you want the player to be able to reset the screen, give them a button that can do so, like Select. Also, let me choose what enemy I am facing in the loading screen whitespace, also like in Devil May Cry 5. Here's how you should have done the tutorial. After exiting cyberspace, or the first level of the game, whatever it will be, ask the player if they've played the game before. If they say they haven't, take them to the loading screen training mode, where they are given 2 crash courses. The first crash course is for helping them get used to Sonic's movement. Give them a chance to adjust the sliders if some things feel off to them, like Sonic's ground or air steering sensitivity. Populate the loading screen with the objects and terrain the player will need to understand how to interact with, so springs, swings, poles, ramps, slopes, hoops, rails, half-pipes, corkscrews, everything. Just a small white void playground they can practice in to get used to how the game functions, similar to Project Hero and Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Then, give them prompts and detailed explanations of how things work, without pausing the game. Just have the prompts on screen. Teach the player the importance of stomp canceling. I've seen several players get through the game and forget the stomp is a movement option, and get frustrated from deaths that could have been avoided by using the stomp cancel. Teach the player the magnet dash mechanic. Once the player is done with the movement tutorial, remind them that they can come back to this screen to practice and adjust Sonic's movement at any time, and then give them the combat tutorial. I'm basing my combat tutorial feedback on the idea that hopefully you listen to my advice and the advice of others that the game has at least 2 attack buttons, has actual combos, and that every move has an actual purpose aside from just damage. Teach them the importance of dodge canceling, parry canceling, and stomp canceling. In the combat tutorial, tell the player to do every move the player has access to at the beginning of the game by separating each combo into a different combo trial. A combo must be completed 3 times in a row successfully before that mission trial is considered completed. Allow the player to keep doing the current combo if they choose to before moving on to the next trial, and also let the player skip a combo trial mission they are on if they choose to do so. Tell the player the purpose of each combo, why they should be doing it, when they should be doing it, and when they shouldn't be. Finally, end the tutorial with a message to experiment that every enemy can be fought in more than one way, and that they can come back to the tutorial void to practice at any time. Anytime the player unlocks a new combo or move, add a new trial for that move to the tutorial list. Also create extra optional combo trials that combine different combo strings, cancels, and special moves together to give the player some inspiration, and show them what is possible. With the tutorial out of the way, we finally make our way to Ouranos, the first of the Starfall Islands. It's really dull visually, and I'm not one of the people that looks at a thing and goes, ew, that doesn't fit in a Sonic game by default, like some people are when it comes to character designs, like the Black Arms or the Zeddy. Anything can work given enough thought and time. The problem with the Starfall Islands is not that they don't fit with Sonic. He's been in many realistic environments throughout the years. City Escapes, Begonia, hell, pretty much every location in SA2 and Unleashed. The issue is that nothing is done with the locations in Frontiers to make them stand out. And outside of cyberspace, there are no out-there locations. Yeah, Unleashed had Adabat, but it also had Eggman Land. Yeah, SA2 had Green Forest, but it also had the Ark levels, Pumpkin Hill, and Pyramid Cave. Ouranos is a generic foresty area. Ares is slightly better with its canyons and indoor areas, but outside of that is your standard desert. Chaos Island is alright visually, again, but then for the last 2, we are back to generic forests again. The entire time I was waiting for a desolate Techno City Island, or an Eggman Carnival, something I felt I could only really get from Sonic. That's not to say Ouranos couldn't have worked visually. Imagine for a moment if instead of the generic forests and grasslands, we got a techno-organic, synthetic look to everything. Like the plants were robotic and everything was covered in circuits. Trees that look real at a glance, but the bark is metallic and the roots are wires. Imagine if every island had this kind of cyberized, synthetic look to it. Eggman says that the Starfall Islands are the CPU of cyberspace. Why not play that up? It's a sad case of wasted potential. Then there's the floating platforms and rails, which stick out like a sore thumb, because they don't match the scenery they are placed in ever, and at times look like a child was scribbling all over parchment that is the sky in this game. Floating platforms and rails have always been a thing in Sonic games. That's not the actual issue. It's the way they are placed, and how they don't look like they were made with the world in mind. Also, the sudden pop-in is atrocious. It didn't stop me from being able to beat the game, but it would constantly take me out of the moment. Pop-in in itself is normal. It's kind of a necessity of a large game. But there are things you can do to mask it and make it look less jarring. You can phase the objects in. In fact, there is a system for that in this game because there are objects related to the puzzles that fade in with a blue hue, and they all should have been like this. From what I've read, the pop-in is like this because Sonic Team just didn't have enough time, so I hope in the future they are given enough time and manpower to make the sequels even better. Speaking of rails, let's talk about Traversal. I'd like less rails and more slopes, loop-de-loops, and half-pipes to take advantage of Sonic's speed, slope jumping, and rolling physics from the drop dash and spin dash. I could see rail grinding still being in the next game, but as a part of grinding on power lines in a city or vines in a forest. These rails and platforms need to match the scenery they are placed in. Many people have said it before, and I'm gonna say it again. The goal of a 3D open zone Sonic should be to emulate the Sonic CD opening visuals. It's also really weird that Sonic couldn't run on water in this game, because Sonic running on water has always been iconic imagery, and one of the most exciting things in the Sonic Advance games and Sonic Unleashed. Sonic Project Hero isn't far off what a lot of Sonic fans would like Sonic to feel like, just exploring the world of the open zone. Combat-wise, going the character action route is absolutely the way to go, rather than the platformer combat in Project Hero, but movement and animation-wise, definitely give this project a look, and maybe pick up the developers to come work for you. Less invisible walls, please. Reward the player for getting to weird places and make every surface climbable and runnable. It never feels good when I get pushed off of a cliff and slide slowly down into the water. There's no reason to not just let me run back up. Chaos Island would be the most fun island in the game to traverse, if not for the 2D sections that constantly blindside you and force you in the wrong direction, because it doesn't have the sliding down cliffs issues that Kronos has, and doesn't have the chasms you get stuck in, because of how Sonic's jump works in vanilla courtesy of Ares Island. On Chaos Island, that mountain is 100% scalable with the Dropdash, and it feels great. I want every mountain surface to be like this. Let me run up these chasms, or let me use my speed and momentum to slope jump up them. Another issue with Chaos Island is the lava. It's instant kill and really easy to run into, especially at higher speeds, let alone power boost. Lava in the parts minigame on the same island just changes the lava into a damage surface, which is what all the lava should be like. While I've talked about the lack of cohesion in the design and art style of the open zone islands, they are still really fun, even if they could be significantly better. And I had an even better time replaying these islands with the Hedgehog May Cry mod, especially on Ares, which solidified it as my favorite island since I could slope jump out of chasms. The platforming of Rhea Island is brilliantly done. It is my favorite climactic level in a 3D platformer since Eggman Land in Unleashed, and it doesn't have those stupid roller coaster sections that control terribly, or werehog platforming sections over bottomless pits, so it's better by default. Had the Rhea Island towers been the lead up to the Supreme boss fight, it wouldn't have felt out of place, and I hope the sequel has a similarly climactic feeling final level in the lead up to its final bosses. Ouranos Island I honestly have very little to say about in comparison, level design wise, because by Chaos Island I was using Big's fishing to skip all the platforming that wasn't related to one of the map challenges. I think boss wise the area has the most fun enemies to fight, but this is the island where it becomes very obvious that Sonic Team was running out of time and money, and didn't have the manpower and budget to truly match their ambitions. But again, with the financial success of Frontiers, my expectations for the next mainline game are really high. Especially now that Sonic Team have proven themselves. The soundtrack in Sonic Frontiers is stellar, and in my opinion, the best in the series. It's criminal the game wasn't nominated for Best Soundtrack at the 2022 Game Awards, because it would have won, hands down, no contest. Now, where the soundtrack kind of falters is in the open zone. Not in the Guardian mini-boss themes, but in the wandering around and exploration bits. The music starts off slow and mysterious, but ramps up and changes a bit according to the story. The songs are by no means bad. In particular, the secondary island movement is one of my favorite songs in the game. It's absolutely fantastic, and very much feels like an updated Dusty Desert from Sonic 06 for the modern era. But outside of that particular song, the open zone tracks are really generic, especially in comparison to the Titan battle themes, the Guardian mini-boss themes, and the CyberSpace tracks, even if they do fit the tone of the game. When I think about what I wish the open zone tracks sounded like, my mind immediately thinks of the map tracks from Sonic Battle and Sonic Advance 3. In particular, Holy Summit and Chaos Angel, which would have fit right in with this game's tone and story, with updated real instruments and triple the length. I'd say about 8 to 9 minutes is the perfect length for a song for each open zone. There should also be battle variations for fighting regular enemies, and challenge variations for sidetracks for each particular open zone theme. Just don't make the intro to those variations as aggravating to listen to as the Werehog's battle theme. Fade into the alternate variations, and fade out to the exploration version. As for what I want from a sequel aesthetic-wise, I want open zone cities and towns, in particular a full 3D recreation of Emerald Town, Night Babylon, and Central City from Sonic Battle, Shadow the Hedgehog, and the comics. As well as a full 3D recreation of Angel Island, Launch Base, Lava Reef, Snowcap, Chaos Angel, etc. All these iconic areas from Sonic 3 and Knuckles and Advance 2 and 3. Bring back Spagonia, because a huge city during a festival is always a fun thing to run through. And I also love Professor Pickle.
Professor?
Hello?
How dare they call this culinary concoction food? Look here, do you see this sorry excuse for a sandwich? The bread should be no less than 3/4 of an inch thick. Upon it, 1 tablespoon of mayonnaise and a pinch of black pepper. The contents, fresh cucumber, sliced thinly, if you please. Am I quite right, Dale?
I think he's one of the best human characters you've ever come up with. And I'd like to see these open zones populated with more people to talk to and do side quests for. These are the kinds of things people want when they say the zones of Sonic Frontiers are uninspired and aren't Sonic-y. As an aside, going forward, going for less detailed and high-fidelity characters and environments, and going for a more shell-shaded, stylized look is the way to go in the future. Not only will that look better and appeal to a wider demographic, you'll also be able to run the game on less powerful hardware, which means more people will be able to purchase it. A world that looks good will always age better than a realistic one. People will still be playing and gushing about the visual styles of Wind Waker, Breath of the Wild, and Genshin Impact for years to come, even if Wind Waker wasn't well received on its initial release due to how different it was from previous games visually. Sonic won't have this issue, because people expect Sonic to look like a cartoon or anime, and the gaming world has matured enough to realize that graphics age, but art direction is timeless. The closer a Sonic game can look to the art depicted in the IDW comics and the animation quality of something like Crash 4 or even Sonic Prime, the better. There is a really cool mod for Sonic Generations that was never completed that gives the game a cel-shaded look. It's not perfect. The game looks way too bright and saturated, but it looks like the beginnings of where the series could and should go visually. Less focus on detailed top-of-the-line graphics, and more focus on stylized character models, environments, and lighting. Sonic games sell best on Nintendo hardware, and Nintendo consoles are always going to lag behind when it comes to graphical power compared to their contemporaries. And that's okay. Working within those limitations can lead to games whose visuals will stand the test of time, because they have to have a great art style to compensate. Thankfully, the Switch doesn't really limit what you can do mechanically, which is all the more reason for me to be excited for the sequel. Animation as a whole could use a lot of work. I heard that Sonic Team is expanding and hiring more talent, and I hope that includes more 3D animators, artists, and visual effects recruits, because there's a lot of stiffness in the animation, not just in combat, but also in traversal and cutscenes. I already pointed out the issues with the drop dash run animation and melee combat, but rail jumping being that static pose looks terrible, and the rail swap animation and trick animations are a downgrade from what was in Generations. Cutscene animations and camera work are a step up from Sonic Forces for the most part, but it is still leagues behind fellow mascot platformers like Crash 4, Ratchet & Clank, and other character action games. And I hope in the next game, we reach that level of animation quality for all cutscenes, because there are two kinds of Frontiers cutscenes. There's the more dynamic cutscenes where characters actually move around and are expressive, but there's weird pauses and stiff animation. And then there are the side stories, which are characters just standing around and barely emoting. I would like every cutscene to be well animated, and for the animation quality to improve. In general, the puzzles can go. They are really mind-numbing in their simplicity and don't really add anything besides filler. Puzzles revolving around the Cyloop, Stomp, and Parry, again assuming you make them timing-based, should come back for the sequel and be more challenging and complex, because it reminds the player that these are important tools in their arsenal and gets them thinking about how they can use them. Now, the race challenges, on the other hand, all the races against the clock that ask you to get from point A to point B are great, and should come back, but be more built with the level geometry and Sonic's physics in mind, as well as be more difficult and strict on the amount of time you are given. A lot of them I finished with 30 seconds or more to spare, and that's without modding, so tightening up that experience to be more challenging and making more of them to make up for the removal of the puzzles would be great. Outside of fighting Guardians for their gears, there's not a lot of a reason to fight enemies, so making combat challenges would be a great way to have an opportunity to mix and match enemy type formations and add variety to side quests that open up the map. Maybe have some challenges that aren't about beating the enemies themselves, but maintaining a certain amount of style for a certain period of time, or beat a specific enemy formation without getting hit. You can get creative with these. More level-focused fights like Ghost, all throughout the game, as a replacement for tile puzzles, would also be appreciated. As for rewards, keep the rewards to defense speed, special meter upgrades, ring capacity, stamina upgrades, EXP, Chao eggs, and map reveals. Again, Sonic's damage should be static so you can actually balance enemy health, and handcraft encounters to be difficult for where the players will be moveset-wise at that point in the game. Challenges should also be replayable, along with the Titan boss fights. Give us an extra hard New Game Plus option as well, because once you finish Frontiers, there's no replayability to the game outside of CyberSpace arcade mode, which I appreciated, because it made recording CyberSpace footage for this video easy, but as I already stated, I hated vanilla CyberSpace, and wanted to replay the other aspects of the game way more, but couldn't. I love the idea of the open zone format, even if it does still need some refinement and polish. You go to the open zone, explore for collectibles that unlock cutscenes, minigames, or quests for progression. Fight bosses in that open zone to get gears to go to traditional 3D Sonic levels, and then complete objectives in those levels to get resources that also progress the main story. Sonic Frontiers is basically a modern-day Collect-A-Thon akin to the old Spyro games, Banjo-Kazooie, the 3D Mario games, Odyssey in particular, etc. In the CyberSpace stages, I like that the red rings are in plain sight, and generally are on the fastest route, most of the time. But I would like an extra optional goal in the form of score, like in Spark the Electric Jester 3. Score would be based upon performing as many tricks as you can, destroying enemies, and collecting rings. Staying in a stage too long invalidates score, so you can't just sit in a stage and farm tricks forever. Overall though, this Collect-A-Thon format was definitely the way to go to move the series forward, rather than a full-on open world like say the Spider-Man games or a Bethesda title. By having several open-ended playgrounds with clear optional objectives for moving the story forward at your own pace, along with traditional 3D Sonic levels, you avoid the issue of games that have too much downtime, like the new God of War games, which are fantastic games, make no mistake, but run into an issue on repeat playthroughs where you spend hours at a time doing nothing but walking and talking you can't really skip, because it's not actually a cutscene. Frontiers unfortunately does have other pacing issues that are different from a game like Ragnarok. The amount of memory tokens you get from doing obstacle courses in comparison to finding token treasure spots and Big's fishing is out of balance. By the time I hit Chaos Island, I stopped going for treasure spots and obstacle courses altogether, and started grinding fishing instead, which I'm happy is an option, but I wouldn't have felt the need to skip Chaos Island through fishing if the platforming and obstacle courses rewarded me with more tokens, and the treasure spots weren't mostly 2D sections, which broke the pace of the game and disoriented me, and the platforming that rewarded me these memory tokens wasn't so automated. Kishimoto-san expressed interest in bringing rolling physics and momentum into the next game, and I'm 100% here for it. The traversal being so engaging for the player is a large part of why the Spider-Man games, and to a lesser extent the Batman Arkham games, are so fun to play, just roaming around. Generally, once you get on a rail, you've basically already gotten the token, which goes back into my criticism of actually designing the world itself with Sonic's tools and movement in mind, and making a Sonic that is constantly engaging to control. But for a first attempt, and in spite of very clear obvious production issues, I'm satisfied with what's on offer for this first outing, and I hope the open zone format will be significantly improved in the future. The UI design needs massive improvement, from the options menu not being immediately clear how you should navigate it because it doesn't work like other games, and requires more button presses than should be necessary. Going into the sub-menus requires pressing a button rather than just letting the player use the analog stick. Your first X button press, or A button press if you're using an Xbox controller, upon entering a menu is often an eaten input, even though it makes the selection sound. Restarting CyberSpace stages can be annoying, because it requires 3 to 4 inputs, depending on whether or not your first input was eaten, when really it should only take 1 to 2 button presses, or just having restart tied to the select button so the player can restart at the push of a button anytime they choose. You have to talk to the Elder Coco 196 times, and you have to wait for an animation to play in between each time you talk to him in order to upgrade Sonic's speed and ring capacity. Something like the Elder Coco should have never happened and should never happen again. Then there's the Starfall slot machine getting in the way of the player's view, causing them to make mistakes in both combat and platforming. There's plenty of room on the top right of the screen for the slot machine to go, or it could have been made smaller and placed right under the map HUD element, instead of taking so much space in the center of the screen. The slot machine also gives too many purple coins too quickly to the player, which again factors into the Collect-A-Thon economy aspect of the game being out of balance. Then there's the fast travel requiring you to switch filters on the map screen, which is not a natural thing to do. Most games would let you fast travel on any filter. During the fishing minigame, whenever you get a gold card, you can't see what the original purple coin values were, so you might waste them on something that was actually cheap, and by the end of the game, the gold tickets were a hindrance, because they had less value than any fish you were catching. The UI in this game needed another pass, or several, but hopefully you'll learn from this for future games. The clean, minimalist computer aesthetic fits the vibe and themes of the game, but are still dull. A lot of games use this kind of simplistic art style for their UI. I, and many others, will always appreciate stylized menu design and visuals that make a game stand out from the competition. For example, the parchment aesthetic that Sonic and the Secret Rings used for its menus were fantastic. The art of the menus were eye-catching, fit the themes of the game, and were functional. Another thing that can replace the puzzles is the Chao Garden. Bring back the Chao Garden for the next game. You can have Chao eggs and Chao Garden related materials drop from enemies, and be rewards from quests and map challenges instead of the red seeds of power. You keep getting requests for it to return for a reason. The Chao Garden of SA2 added so much to that game's replayability and length. Bring it back and improve upon it. Not just Chao races and Chao karate, but full-on Chao RPG battles. If your next game included an improved Chao Garden with new mechanics and an online component that let players trade and battle their Chao online, that game would sell like hotcakes on just that, and would definitely boost review scores. It likely won't ever reach Pokemon sales figures, but not a lot of games really can. But every Sonic game that goes by without a Chao Garden is still leaving money on the table that could also be used to expand Sonic Team and increase Sega's profits. It is insane how much time has gone by without dedicating a small team and a fair amount of resources to developing and improving the Chao Garden. Big's fishing is cool, though I wish it got a bit more intricate as the game progressed. I would like it in the future for all the Big the Cat fishing sections to use every single QTE prompt in the game eventually, since it would also prepare the player to do the same in future boss fights. I loved that moment in the Wyvern fight when the Ripple prompt appeared, because I instantly knew what it was from having done it already while fishing with Big. and I was confused during the end when a QTE prompt I had never seen before showed up out of nowhere, but I wouldn't have been confused if I had encountered it during the fishing minigames too. As for the fishing economy, I kinda like that it's an alternative way to get the resources you need to progress, but I dislike that it's a bit too easy to get everything you need to progress from just fishing. And I also dislike that you can only get fast travel scrolls and egg memos from here. It should be an option to get those things from fishing, sure, but I should also be able to find them out in the open zones itself. Those Eggman ships were the perfect place to find the egg memos. While we are on the subject of the egg memos, these were brilliantly written, brilliantly voice acted, and brilliantly voice directed. Frontiers has the best voice direction the series has ever had. The only game that even comes close is Black Knight. I have never enjoyed listening to Roger's Sonic voice more, and telling him to be a bit more serious and way more laid back, like he is in the Sonic Boom cartoon, was a great move, and fits Sonic's freedom-loving anti-oppression attitude. Back to the egg memos, I love the references and nods to the series' past games as well as the comics. But the most important thing we got out of them is characterization for Ivo Robotnik. This is the most human and interesting he's been since Sonic Adventure 2, and I loved it.
I never really knew my cousin Maria. Everyone spoke of her like she was very special. All that love for someone who was gone when I was right there. But I have to wonder, back then, was she anything like Sage is now?
I cannot gush enough about how happy listening to the egg memos made me. The downside to them is that I wish that some of them were cutscenes, and in some cases, vital info for understanding character motivations and the lore of the series is locked behind a fishing minigame, which is why these, again, should have been discoverable in the zones as well, because without it, Eggman's relationship with Sage doesn't hit as hard as it should. Eggman contemplating Maria and implying that the reason he's so messed up in the head is because of the impact her death directly and indirectly had on his family life is incredible characterization and world building. My mind went racing listening to Egg Memo 17 because it says so much with so few lines of dialogue. The amount of venom, disdain, as well as sorrow in Mike Pollock's vocal performance is stellar. Another issue with the Egg Memos is that you can't listen to them on the go, like you can voice logs in other games, because you can only listen to them in the big fishing spots. Speaking to listening to audio logs on the go, bring in Night and Dawn from the IDW comics, and let the player listen to their radio show as they play the game and explore the open zones. In Spider-Man PS4, J. Jonah Jameson has his own podcast that the player can listen to as you swing through New York City, with almost 2 hours worth of content.
This is Just the Facts with J. Jonah Jameson, where listeners like you discuss the issues affecting our city with Pulitzer Prize-winning two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning former publisher of the Daily Bugle. Hey, plug the book. And as always, if you order Mr. Jameson's book, Spider-Man, Threat or Menace, within 24 hours of our broadcast, you'll get an autographed copy at no extra charge.
No personalizations, don't ask, not gonna get it. Welcome to Just the Facts with J. Jonah Jameson, alerting you to the threats you don't even know about. Let's dive right into the calls. Speak.
Okay, so not for nothing, you gotta give Spider-Man respect for taking down Wilson Fisk, right? I mean, one less mob boss is good for everybody.
Is that right? Tell me, are you a police officer? Prosecutor? Maybe an award-winning reporter with decades on the job like me?
No, I'm a plumber.
Oh, good. Then fix my toilet and shut up! Let me explain something to you about crime bosses. Soon as one goes down, every punk with a gun, a tracksuit, and a drawer full of gold chains decides he's the next godfather. We're gonna have a gang war in the streets, but does that whip-headed moron give a damn? Of course not. He got on TV. That's what counts.
Yeah, well, I can get copper pipe without paying kickbacks now. So until that gang war starts, I'm on the webhead side.
And you'll be singing a different tune when 3 new mobs are lining up to charge you triple for that same pipe. Or just break your legs. Goodbye!
You could do the same for Night and Dawn for future games, and it would work perfectly. While I'd love to see this duo in person on screen at some point, I'd settle for just listening to their show on the go. In regards to Sonic's open zone dialogue, I wish it was more easily accessible. Sonic says a lot of interesting things in his voice barks out in the open zone, and I only got to hear about 4. One of the Omega lines, talking about the giant mirror web, wondering about the homes on Kronos, and the end giving me a tutorial reminder. The reason I only got to hear these is because Sonic only says these things if you remain idle for around 10 minutes, and getting rings and getting into fights resets the counter. Now, there is the fear of making your character too chatty while wandering around. This was an issue for Bubsy, and if you need a Sonic example, the characters in Sonic Heroes and Sonic Boom never shut up. Sonic should absolutely talk and be talked to during gameplay, especially now that you have great writers like Ian Flynn and Evan Stanley at your disposal. Just have a voice line frequency slider so that the player can choose how much they want Sonic to talk their ears off. Now, if you do put vital information in those voice barks, like the confirmation that IDW is canon, which I'm really happy about, by the way, they should be something every single player will get. As for what Sonic says during these, I found very few of the references grating, and they would only bother me if I heard them in rapid succession like I had to for the sake of making this critique video. In fact, I think it's really good characterization for Sonic to be constantly thinking about his friends when he's alone, and also hoping Zavok is suffering, because screw Zavok, he's a hideously evil person that I want to see more of in the next game. Because I love the way Ian Flynn writes him. In the comics, he is basically the Sonic equivalent of Bane, and I mean that as a compliment. In the future, Sonic's voice barks should be less repetitive in their content, more relevant to what's currently going on in the story, and less about referencing past events. Well, I can't give compliments to the writer and not talk about the story. This is the best Sonic story since Sonic Battle for me. I've stated many times that Sonic Battle's story is how I fell in love with these characters and this franchise. And Sonic Frontiers brought that spark back. While I had played many Sonic games before Battle, Sonic 2 was one of the first video games I ever played, I would not be a Sonic fan and care so much about the world and characters had I not experienced Sonic Battle's story. There are some issues with Frontier's story, sure, and we'll get to those. But as a cohesive whole, hats off to Ian Flynn and everyone else responsible for this story. As previously stated, this game made me laugh and cry, and the story did a lot of the heavy lifting for that. Plot-wise, the game is threadbare, but people often forget plot is only a single aspect of a story. Final Fantasy VI is my second favorite game of all time. It is a game with tons of plot right up until the middle of the game, where the plot pretty much stops. And then it becomes a brilliant character study of an incredible ensemble cast. Mass Effect 2 is similar in that it's about assembling a team to deal with the background scheme of the Reapers. But only about 5% of the game is about dealing with the Reaper threat. The meat of that story is the character interactions and characterization of the crew and your Shepard. Sonic Frontier's story is kind of like those games. This is a story about Sonic and his friends, what makes them tick, their hopes and their desires, their relationships, the impact Sonic has on their lives, the changes he inspires in them, and how he helps and encourages them to move forward, including Dr. Eggman and Sage, who is the best new addition to the Sonic series since Blaze and Silver. And I'm happy she'll be sticking around. I can't wait for her to show up in the IDW comics and have interactions with Metal Sonic and Bell. Speaking of characters, I really want to talk about the Tails scene that acknowledges Tails' regression, or rather, inconsistency over the years. People think it's just referencing the events of Force's SA1, SA2, and Lost World, but it's not. It's also referencing the time he ran away and Unleashed, the time Sonic didn't trust him to help in Colors and sent him back to Earth. It's talking about the entire history of this character and teaching a good lesson out of it. You are going to make mistakes. You aren't perfect. There will be times when your spirit will waver, and you'll relapse into old habits. People seem to think it's Ian dunking on the previous writers, but it's not. Self-improvement in real life is not a straight line, and character development doesn't have to be either. Rather than ignoring mistakes Tails has made, or pointing at those mistakes and laughing, the story in Frontiers recontextualizes all those moments. In fact, I'm annoyed so many people missed this point, because the lyrics of Undefeatable spell this out to the player. Sega and Sonic Team are done running away from past mistakes. Instead, they are looking back at what didn't work and why it didn't work, embracing those moments, and turning those mistakes into something great. I have never been more in love with Tails as a character, and Ian as a writer, than in this moment. All the references the characters make during dialogue make perfect sense in context, and are the exact things they should be bringing up in these moments, with a few exceptions. Tails' Dark Gaia power scaling comment rubbed me the wrong way. He didn't even encounter or fight Dark Gaia in Unleashed, outside of running away from some of his grunts in his first appearance. But I can let it slide despite how much it irked me. One I won't let slide is the egg carrier reference in regards to the lasers on Chaos Island, because that is ridiculous. There's no reason for Sonic to think about that specific laser given how little impact the egg carrier had, and how many other lasers are in the series that he's seen before and after it. The Death Egg robot from Sonic 3, the Egg Fleet lasers in Sonic Heroes, the final egg blaster from Sonic Battle, which was capable of destroying an entire solar system, by the way, and many more. This was the only reference where I went, okay, you're going too far, dial it back, Ian. Then Tails says each one of these is almost on par with the Eclipse Cannon, without having an internal power supply, which is patently absurd, because it's not only an absurd level of power creep, but also sells short the brilliance of Professor Jailed Robotnik. But I'm willing to forgive this because it makes perfect sense that you'd need this kind of firepower to combat an enemy as dangerous as the End. I initially raised an eyebrow when Sonic was defeated by Giganto at the start of the game. Ian has been known to seriously downplay how ridiculously powerful base Sonic is. Whether it's trolling or not is sometimes hard to tell, but there are times it gets absurd. While I know Ian doesn't like that base Sonic defeated Perfect Chaos in Generations, that's not something you can walk back without making people furious, especially since Sonic beat Ultimate Emerald, which is a significantly more impressive feat. This is the same Sonic that killed Ultimate Emerald without any Chaos Emeralds or assistance of any kind in under 20 seconds. I can't stress enough how this is the most impressive non-superform feat in the entire franchise. Keep in mind, Ultimate Emerald could move at Mach 1 as a baseline, had powers and abilities of pretty much every character in the cast, and the experience to use those abilities to their full potential, had enhanced durability and regeneration thanks to Chaos, absorbed the data of the final Egg Blaster, which makes him at bare minimum a solar system level threat with no sense of self-preservation, and Sonic dealt him a fatal blow within 20 seconds of intense fighting. That said, after we learn more about the Titans and the threat they were created to combat, it makes perfect sense that the best Sonic could do was nudge Giganto a bit. The ancients built these mechs using the power of the Chaos Emeralds in the hopes of combating the End, which is such an insanely powerful entity, base Sonic could never even hope to come close to matching its level of power, even with years of training and experience. While downplaying how broken characters are can lead to a more interesting story, you do lose out on hype factor, and hype gets people in the door. Good storytelling and gameplay keep people, but the marketing strategy of the Mystery of Sonic Frontiers was not doing anyone any favors. Remember, despite not being as mechanically complex as it could and should be, the Titan fights are a selling point, because of how hype and over the top they are, as they evoke that feeling of playing Metal Gear Rising Revengeance for the first time again. And you should lean into the overpowered nature of these characters more often, not just in super form, but for base forms as well. Embrace Sonic's Dragon Ball Z heritage, minus the charging for 5 minutes, and lean into it more, because it allows for more hype gameplay and story beats. It does wonders for Kirby. There should absolutely still be a wide power gap between Sonic and Super Sonic, and the things Super Sonic would fight going forward. I love those set pieces where you fight the Titans as, well, fight, more of encounter the Titans as base Sonic and just can't do anything to them, and then you get to fight them as Super Sonic. In fact, I would actually like more of those kind of set pieces with the Titans going forward, or whatever would be the replacement for the Titans. But Sonic and company should be indulging in Metal Gear Rising nonsense more often, while Super Sonic is getting the Asura's Wrath level set pieces. Onto the pacing issues. Frontier's story is a bit too meandering and repetitive. Characters question the same things over and over. Sonic asks about Amy's condition 3 times on Chronos if you are doing a 100% run. Sage and Sonic's interactions up until Chaos Island can largely be boiled down to the same thing. Sonic tries to ask Sage a question about what's going on. Sage refuses and gives the same answers of, "I will not share data with an enemy," or "It won't matter if I tell you." It gets to a point where I get annoyed that Sonic won't ask, "If giving me answers won't change the outcome, what's the harm in telling me then?" Even if it leads to Sage saying, "Eggman won't allow me," though Sonic stops asking, it would at least alleviate this issue of repetition. If you aren't doing side quests, probably won't feel that repetitive, but if you are doing the side stories, it becomes very noticeable. And if you aren't doing them, you are missing out on great character interactions, dialogue, and world building. The story of the islands is really formulaic. Sonic goes to an island, rescues a friend, encounters a Titan, learns a bit about the history of the islands, fights a Titan, go to the next island. In Sly 2 Band of Thieves, which probably has the strongest narrative a 3D platformer has ever had, and is much darker in tone than most games of its ilk, similar to Frontiers, it establishes a formula, and then breaks that formula by the end of the third world, which flips everything on its head, and helps keep the audience engaged. The strength of establishing a formula is the pop-offs that happen every time you deviate from it in interesting ways. Frontiers doesn't shake up its formula until its 4th world. By that point, you're only a couple of hours from the end of the game. For example, there's never a moment where Sonic thinks he's beaten a Titan, exits his super form, the Titan gets back up, and Sonic has to finish it off in his base form. Or a moment where Sonic has to fight a Titan from inside as a platforming sequence. There's no moment where, narratively, Sonic has to approach a full island or two in a completely different way from previous ones. For example, in Sly 2, where you have to start episode 4 as Bentley, and have to work your way to unlocking the other 2 members of the Cooper Gang, and the unique challenges of exploring and learning the layout of a zone with a character that doesn't have Sly's acrobatics, so they have to play to their unique strengths to get around. Bentley still feels like Sly to control and run around as, but there are interactables that only Sly can make use of, on top of Sly, Murray, and Bentley all having different moves and abilities that the others do not. Frontier's biggest issue narratively is that there isn't a lot here for people that don't already love this franchise. If you care about these characters and you know what they've been through, this story is fantastic. But if you don't already love Sonic the character, you don't know or don't care who Tails and Amy are, or have a warped perspective of them, you aren't really going to have fun with this story, because it's all about the characters. And if your opinions of the characters were already negative for one reason or another, this game won't sway you. While the world building and characterization are stellar, it's all built off the backs of events that happened prior, and without a codex to get people up to speed, more on this later, it's going to fall flat for newcomers. There is barely any plot, and what little there is a slow burn. And the animation quality of the cutscenes and the art direction also aren't strong enough to carry the type of story that's being told. If you were interested in the mystery aspects, well, too bad, because Sage spells it all out for you on Ouranos Island, for those that weren't paying attention. If you were paying attention, you were probably annoyed by this. And if you weren't paying attention, you didn't care about the story to begin with. Instead of the last island re-explaining everything the player should have already figured out, the cutscenes of the final island should have been about furthering Sage and Eggman's father and daughter relationship, as well as giving Sonic, Sage, and Eggman a chance to bounce off each other as characters now that the mystery is solved, as well as giving more screen time and characterization to the end, rather than just shoving it all into a monologue during the final boss that's hard to listen to because you're trying not to die. Then there's the moment where they conclude that Sonic was able to escape cyberspace because they were his past memories, which makes no sense, because Eggman should have been able to leave too if that's the case. And it contradicts what the end says at the start of the game. It's already been established that Sonic's speed has some degree of reality warping properties, capable of restoring erased time back in Sonic Generations, which isn't even all that far-fetched, since Sonic almost outran a black hole after an intense fight with Dr. Eggman one game prior. The end's explanation of Sonic escaping through his own power makes more sense, and is in line with what's already been established. Remember how I said hype gets people in the door? Part of that is strong, memorable plot beats, like Sonic getting arrested at the start of Sonic Adventure 2 and snowboarding down a busy street, sending cars flying as he goes by. Eggman blowing up the moon midway through and putting everyone on a timer. The moment where Shadow saves Rouge from an island-wide explosion. While SA2's plot has issues, it always felt like things were happening. The only thing here for people who aren't already Sonic fans are the Titan fights. Well, the first 3 anyway, which are few and far between. That's it. That's the only thing for them. If someone were to say, hey, I want to get into Sonic, where should I start? I would absolutely say Sonic Frontiers for gameplay, but narratively, the first 2 arcs of the IDW comics, Sonic Battle, Sonic and the Black Knight, and Sonic Adventure 2 are significantly better jumping on points. Again, that's not to say the story is bad. It's not. In fact, as I said earlier, it's really good, in spite of the negative aspects. Or that this story can't be enjoyed by new players. New players can still enjoy the story. They just won't get as much out of it as someone like me who's really invested in the story, lore, and characters that's already been established. This is the lore-focused game, and that's fine. But for the next game, I hope that lore is pushed a bit more into the background, something the player has to actively go looking for and discovering, and that for the next game, the plot is given more of a focus, and that you involved Ian Flynn and Evan Stanley, as well as the rest of the kind folks that make Sonic IDW so amazing, more heavily in the narrative creation process. The funniest moment of bad pacing, even if it did succeed in making me cry, is on Chaos Island with Sage's song. This entire cutscene of Sonic and Tails' unbreakable brotherly bond, and Sage's sorrow over being unsure if she'll ever have that same familiar bond within the Eggman Empire, on top of her being sad that Sonic and Tails' beautiful family is fated to crumble away once the end gets loose, is amazing, right up until the flashbacks of Sage and Eggman's interactions, which I had just watched not even 15 minutes ago. Those flashbacks, coupled with the Dear Father leitmotif, without the actual lyrics, just sad child noises, made this moment unintentionally hilarious. If you just cut the flashbacks and just showed Sage crying as she flickers in and out, this scene would have been so much more powerful. The most jarring of the pacing issues in the game comes in the form of the cyberspace corruption plotline. You spend most of the game with Sonic getting worse and worse as cyberspace corrupts him. And then the issue is suddenly solved with the power of friendship at the end of Rhea Island. Then, after we beat the end, Sonic's friends are suddenly released from cyberspace, which makes no sense because the end wasn't involved with that, or was it? It's not clear. Remember how I said multiple playable characters would have enhanced the narrative? This is what I was referring to. Now, if Sonic's corruption being removed had been preceded by a gameplay section where you play as Tails, Knuckles, and Amy, similar to Cannon's Core from SA2, Metal Madness from Sonic Heroes, End of the World from Sonic 06, etc., then this moment would have had the narrative weight it should have had. I hope that when we finally get DLC 3, this is something that will get added to the game, on top of them having more involvement with the end's defeat, and the end having a proper boss fight instead of being a minigame and a cutscene. There is also this disconnect with how the player feels versus how Sonic and his friends are acting at the end. Sage tells Sonic to look after her dad. He then proceeds to not do that, and goes off to celebrate with Tails, Knuckles, and Amy. This is in stark contrast to how Sonic and his friends and Eggman reacted to thinking Shadow was dead in SA2. If there was a scene of Sonic attempting to comfort or console Eggman, and Eggman's just not having it and flies off in a huff to get his daughter back, or something along those lines, it would be a lot less jarring. The biggest issue with Ian Flynn as a writer, and I'm saying this as a man that loves Ian Flynn as a writer, is that his ability to write exposition ranges from good to textbook bad exposition 101. Here's an example of how you don't do exposition from issue 14 of IDW, courtesy of the Adrenaline dubs.
We're here to stop Eggman from performing an encore. Which way?
The command.
Here's an example of bad exposition from this very game.
You've experienced yourself the limitless power of the Chaos Emeralds.
This is known as you know exposition. It's a situation where a character says something to a character that they already know for the audience's convenience, in a very clunky and unnatural way. The prequel comic is rife with this stuff. The issue with this kind of exposition is obvious. This is A, not how people talk in real life, and B, annoys the listener or reader that already knows the deal. It's a large part of why the opening of Mass Effect 3 is so terrible, because it's a constant barrage of as-you-know exposition.
You can't save them all. Exactly. They get so fast. I thought we'd have more time.
We knew they were coming.
And they still just cut through our defenses. We need to go to the Citadel. Talk to the Council.
The Citadel? The fight's here.
It'll be everywhere soon enough. You said it yourself. The Reapers will destroy everything if we don't stop them. The Council has to help us. You sure about that? No, but you're a Council Spectre. That has to count for something. Gotcha!
Thanks. I owe you one.
More than one. Grab some ammo.
As you know, exposition is infamous, because if I know something, you shouldn't have to explain it to me.
Slave evil puppet kind of scenario?
You're telling me my plan. I already know my plan. I made up the plan. It's my plan. What I don't know is how close you are to accomplishing my plan!
Ooh, yeah, kind of an outdoor voice there. Okay.
Now, an example of really great exposition is this scene from Mortal Kombat 11.
Kronika may seek to co-opt them. What of Sub-Zero?
Already on his way to shut down the factory. Grandmaster Hasashi is going with him.
Grandmaster Hasashi? Hanzo Hasashi?
A bad writer would have Raiden say, Hanzo Hasashi? You mean Scorpion? This scene is great because the people who know what's going on and know exactly why past Raiden would be so surprised by this. People who don't know and are paying attention will connect the dots in the next scene. Examples of good exposition in this very game are found in Egg Memos 7 and 17. In 7, Eggman muses about all the past civilizations that have walked upon Sonic's world without having to overload a new player with the information or clunky dialogue, because the nuances of the civilizations themselves isn't important. Just the fact that they existed and were notable enough for Eggman to consider them in regards to the Ancients. In Egg Memo 17, you don't need to know anything about Maria to realize from the way Eggman talks about her that she was someone that was really important to the setting and his life. People who already know are going crazy, but people who don't can at least get the gist from the context clues if they are actually paying attention and actually care about the story. And if they want to know more, this is what the codex entries are for. Well, you obviously want to get new players used to this world and characters. How do you do that? The answer is really simple and was solved a long time ago. Getting people up to speed on lore details and character information they need to know from previous games, and other media like comics and novels or cultural osmosis is what in-game character bios and codex entries are for. This game should have had character bios and codex entries with flavor text for whenever Sonic makes references to past games, comics, characters, or events. I need to stress, these should be for getting people caught up on the past only. If you want to bring Tangle, Whisper, Surge, Kit, Night and Dawn, etc. in the next game, and you should, I want these characters to be there. Character bios and codex entries on who they are, where they are from, what they do, etc. to get new players and readers up to speed is all you need to do. That's what they're there for. Don't do clunky as-you-know exposition or character introductions that may or may not work. The characters showed up and are here, the end. Pay attention to the context clues, or read the bios and codex entries if you want more. They are not for filling in crucial plot details, which is Final Fantasy XIII's primary flaw narratively. Final Fantasy XIII is a game that starts in media res, takes no time to teach you about this world or how it works, even if you're paying attention. If you want to get the gist of what's going on, you need to read mountains upon mountains of text, which is a hard pill to swallow in that game, because unlike Sonic or Mass Effect 2, which has a rich lore and story that's been built up over multiple games, Final Fantasy XIII at the time was just one game. Make sure to have character bios and codex entries, or at least the really important ones, be fully voiced, because that makes them more digestible for new players and old fans alike. You could also include an optional voiced intro that summarizes the history of the setting and major events up to that point, like the Mass Effect games and Devil May Cry 5. Devil May Cry 5's intro even talks about the events of the anime, which practically no one saw or thought was actually canon up to that point, so of course they needed to tell people what happened in it. Future Sonic games could and should do the same thing. I need to stress, one last time, these things should be in the game itself, not in a free online comic, or a Tales 2 video, or in a prologue animation. I'm saying that as someone who enjoys watching and reading these things. Reviewers are going to review the content of the game as it is, not any of the promotional material that's released alongside it, regardless of how easily accessible or how high quality it is. The last thing we need to talk about is the mandatory minigames for story progression. I don't hate them. Some are actually pretty good, like the one where you cut grass with the Cyloop, and the Knuckles one where you need to climb multiple towers to kill them quickly, because it helps you get used to the mechanics of the game. There's the ones that are inoffensive, like the first Amy minigame, where you guide the Coco, and the hacking minigames. There's the head-scratching ones, like the Rescue Cocos from Under Towers, and the Guide the Coco again while they drop smoke bombs on Ares. And then there are the ones that are actively terrible, like the skydiving bridge minigame, get 600 parts for the weapon, and the pinball minigame on Chaos Island. Now, I actually beat the pinball minigame on my first try, and it was an incredibly stressful experience because I immediately lost 2 lives due to the wonky pinball physics. And instead of restarting like a sane person, I kept playing. That said, asking for 5 million points and then asking the player to hit the top of the pinball machine in 3 lives is a big ask. It should have had A, proper pinball physics, and B, the score requirements been more reasonable, or at least had other pinball sections in the game with less demanding requirements. It would have lessened the narrative weight and shock of seeing a pinball machine in a volcano, but at least it would have been an easier pill to swallow. The parts minigame is frustrating because it's not actually hard or even all that bad once you understand what it really wants from you, but the process of stopping to pick up bolts instead of just having them magnetized to Sonic, like in the Ratchet & Clank games after he breaks a box open, is unintuitive. The skydiving bridge minigame would be great if it wasn't timed, because pretty much everyone beats it within milliseconds to spare. The avoid getting hit 3 times requirement is enough of a challenge, and if it wasn't tied to the most frustrating invisible wall in the entire game, this mission would have been better received. Sonic can very clearly get over to that island with either a bird or a well-aligned ramp jump and air dash. But nope. There is a massive invisible wall that stops you. At least on previous islands, there is a clear object Sonic needs to interact with to progress the story. On Chaos Island, natural gaming instincts are going to make the player think they need to go to the other island first before they can lower the drawbridge. They aren't going to think a story mission that's rather late into the island's runtime is the path forward. I really hope there will be less of these invisible walls in future installments. Minigame, or rather story quests going forward, I hope will have more to do with Sonic's actual abilities and movement, like the good minigames I mentioned. I liked the constant variety throughout the game, but I wish the variety was at a consistent high quality. That's it from me. Thank you so much for watching this behemoth of a video. It really means a lot to me. I hope this inspires positive change in the future of the franchise, as I've never been more positive and excited for Sonic's future. Remember to like the video and share it around. If this could somehow reach the kind people at Sonic Team and give them something to work with for the future, I'd be eternally thankful. As for what's next for the channel, I'm still very much in a Sonic mood, so expect more Sonic content from me on earlier games in the franchise. Until then, take care.